The survivors report. I could never forget that day, even after all these years. I was 9 and came home alone from school, as I did every day. The streets of the neighborhood were familiar. Every corner kept memories of playing with my friends. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, and I was distracted, thinking about the drawing that the teacher praised. Carrying my heavy backpack on my back, full of books and scribbled notebooks. It was then that I felt a shiver go through my spine. I looked over my shoulder and saw a man I had never seen before. He was tall, wore a dark coat, and wore an old hat that hid part of his face. What caught my attention was the big bag he carried, similar to those used to transport potatoes or coal. His eyes were fixed on me, and he was muttering something I could not understand, as if he was speaking in another language or talking to himself. My heart shot, and a sense of danger took hold of me. I accelerated the step, trying not to show fear, but every time I looked back discreetly, there he was, keeping the same distance. The continuous and incomprehensible murmur made everything even more frightening. I thought about running straight home, but something told me that I shouldn't take that stranger there. I remembered a vacant lot that was a few streets away, a place my parents always forbade me to go because it was dangerous, but at that moment it seemed my only option. I decided to change the route and turn around the next corner, entering the street that led to the field. The man continued to follow me, and panic began to take hold. I felt my heart beat so hard that it seemed like it was going to jump out of my chest. As soon as I got to the wasteland, the first thing I noticed was silence. There were no usual sounds of birds or wind in the trees. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. The ground was full of tall bushes, remnants of old furniture, and pieces of wood piled in some corners. Not thought twice, and threw myself behind a pile of rubble, trying to control my breath that came out in gills. My backpack was making noise as I adjusted, so I let it out slowly, praying that it would not attract attention. I stood there, reclining, as I tried to hear any sign that the man was still following me. It wasn't long before I heard his footsteps. They were heavy, rhythmic, as if he was dragging something. My whole body became stiff, and I felt paralyzed, unable to think of anything but not making noise. His murmurs became louder, but still made no sense. It was like a strange song, something repeated several times, but without rhythm. The sound of something being dragged began to become clearer. He was not just walking, he was pulling something heavy. I tried to peek through the rubble holes, but could only see his silhouette moving slowly across the ground. He stopped a few meters from where I was, and I swear I felt that he knew I was there. I could hardly breathe. Every movement he made seemed to amplify the sound around me. The bag he was carrying now was on the ground, and he dragged it through the bush as if it were a dead weight. The sound of the dry leaves and branches breaking was so high that it made my heart beat in my ears. My mind ran in 1,000 directions. What if he found me? What if no one ever knew what happened to me? Closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself down, but the sound of approaching steps brought me back. He was coming towards me. The murmurs continued, but now mixed with a heavy breath as if he was tired or anxious. Then suddenly he stopped. I was still not daring to move a muscle. At the corner of my eye, I saw the tip of the bag appear behind the pile of rubble. It was dark and stained, as if it had been dragged by mud. For a moment, I thought he was going to find me, but then I heard a noise further away. It seemed to be the meow of a cat or something. He turned his face towards the sound, hesitated for a few seconds, and began to slowly move away. I did not have the courage to leave my hiding place. I stood there, shaking, listening to his footsteps become more and more distant. But what made me even more terrified was the noise of the sack being dragged, which did not seem to move away with the steps, as if something was holding it, or as if it had its own will. After the sounds finally disappeared, I stood there for a few more minutes, trying to find the courage to move. My muscles hurt from being so much shrinking, and my breathing was still shallow. I looked around to make sure he had really gone away. The wasteland looked even more sinister now, as if it had absorbed the tension of that moment. The silence was almost suffocating. I took my backpack slowly, trying not to make noise, and started crawling through the high bush, keeping me low. My only goal was to get out of there as quickly as possible, without attracting attention. When I got to the street, my legs hardly responded. I could barely walk straight, as if fear had drained all the strength of my body. I looked around, and the street was deserted. There was no sign of the man or anyone else. I ran as far as I could until I got to my house. When I came in, my mother was in the kitchen and barely raised her eyes of what she was doing. I tried to tell what happened, but the words came out overpowered, and she just gave a little laugh, saying that I had a very fertile imagination for my age. I stared at her, stunned. How could she not see the dread in my eyes? I went up to my room and locked myself there. I spent the rest of the night listening to any sound coming from outside, expecting the worst. The following days were a blur. I avoided passing near the wasteland and made sure to take the longest way to get home. The image of that man and the bag he carried was spinning in my head. I tried to forget, tried to convince myself that maybe I had overdone, but something did not let me move on. It wasn't just fear. It was that uncomfortable feeling that I had escaped something much worse. Even so, no one seemed to take seriously what I said. My father laughed, saying it was a story of children, and my mother only asked me to stop scaring my younger brother with this nonsense. Years later, when I was about 15, I was looking at my cousin's computer, and out of curiosity, I decided to search for disappearances in my city. I didn't expect to find anything relevant, but what I saw made me cold. There was an old article about missing children, dating back to the time I was a little girl. All cases were in the same region where I lived, and the strangest was the description of the witnesses. A tall man carrying a large bag. The words seemed to scream on the screen, and I felt a wave of panic. I was staring at the monitor, unable to move, while that memory I tried to bury came back with full force. At that moment, I understood it was not imagination. I had really escaped something, or someone very dangerous. After finding this out, I started to wonder how no one had connected the disappearances to the man with the bag. There were enough reports to put together a pattern, but it seemed that no one had paid much attention. Perhaps because the witnesses were children, and people simply preferred to believe that they were made-up stories. As much as I wanted to forget what I had lived, the weight of that discovery tormented me. I became obsessed, reading and rereading the few details that I could find. There was only one thing in common between the reports. All the children had disappeared near the wasteland where I hid that day. To this day, I can't understand why he let me escape. There was no one around, no adult to intervene. Maybe it was luck, or maybe the noise I heard really distracted him. But sometimes when I think about it, I can't help feeling that there was something else, something I never realized at the time. Whenever I walk through a wasteland, I feel that same shiver, as if some part of me was still stuck at the moment, trying to run, trying to hide. I don't know who that man was, or what was in that bag. But what scares me the most is knowing that years later, he may still be out there looking for his next victim. The myth of the urban kidnapper. I clearly remember the day I first noticed that man. It was early autumn, and the afternoons were colder and darker earlier. My son, who was 7 years old at the time, always came back from school with some friends, and they passed by the small square near our house. The neighborhood was very quiet, the kind of place where children still played on the street without big worries. But that week, something changed. A man began to appear near the school and the square. He had a common look, the kind of face you could easily forget, but what caught your attention was the bag he carried. It looked like a market bag, always full and slightly crumpled, as if he was carrying something bulky and heavy. The children started talking about him at home, but in an innocent way. My son commented that the BagMan offered candy and small toys, such as those that come in shopping machines. Some mothers said that it was just a street vendor trying to make a living, and that we were overdoing it. But I had a strange feeling, like something didn't fit. He never seemed to sell anything to adults, only kids. Always near the school or the square. And the way he looked, I can't explain. It was as if I was too attentive, as if I expected something. I tried to ignore it, but that bad feeling only got worse. On Friday of that same week, something happened that I could not ignore. I arrived early at school to pick up my son, and there was the man. He was leaning against a wall with the bag on the floor, watching the children running out of the gate. He had a strange smile on his face, that kind of smile that doesn't seem friendly but forced. I saw him offer a lollipop to a girl who hesitated before picking it up and running away. I looked around and saw no other adult paying attention to him. My heart popped, but at the same time I wondered if I was being too paranoid. Maybe it was just a salesman trying to be nice. Still, I decided that I would stay around until I was sure my son was safe. When I finally saw my son leaving, I noticed that he was holding something in his hands. It was a small cart of those cheap plastic. I asked where he had gotten it, and he pointed to the man. I felt my stomach turn. I approached, trying not to look nervous, and asked directly, "Did you give this to him?" The man smiled and said yes, saying that he liked to see the children happy, and that it was just a kindness. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that bothered me deeply. I did not argue, just hold my son by the hand, and we left. As we walked home, I couldn't stop thinking how strange that was. Who does something like this for no apparent reason? Something inside me screamed that it was not right. The next day, the whole town seemed in shock. A child had disappeared. Her name was Sophia, and she studied at the same school as my son. She was only 8 years old, and the last time someone saw her was near the square, late in the afternoon. I felt a shiver go through my body when I heard the news. My mind went straight to the man in the bag. Did he have something to do with it? I called some of the mothers in the school group, and several said they remembered their children mentioning him. But as always, there were those who said that it was only coincidence, that we were exaggerating. "Stop feeding paranoia, people," said a mother in the group. But I couldn't stop thinking about that smile and the way he looked at the children. I decided to ask my son directly if he had seen the man on the day Sophia disappeared. He hesitated for a moment, but then said yes. He was in the square, sitting on the same bench as always, with the bag at his feet. My son said that Sophia was playing rope jump with some friends, but at some point she stopped and went to him. She seemed curious, he said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. My heart shot up, and I felt a lump in my throat. What could he have said or done to attract her? I couldn't get rid of the feeling that everything was connected, but when I mentioned it to my husband, he looked at me as if I was going crazy. "You're letting imagination run wild," he said, with a tone that mixed impatience and disbelief. But I knew it wasn't imagination. Something was very wrong. After that day, it seemed like the whole neighborhood was more tense. Parents started picking up their children at school more often, and the little square, which was always full of children running and playing, was now almost empty. But the man with the bag kept showing up. I saw him twice from afar that week, always in the same place, sitting on the bench or leaning against the wall, watching. I didn't know if it was paranoia, but he seemed to be more attentive, as if he knew that people were beginning to distrust him. I wanted to confront him, but something told me he was dangerous. So I just watched, hoping someone would do something. On Friday, I took courage and talked to one of the school teachers about him. She became serious, but seemed more concerned with keeping order than taking action. "We've warned parents to be careful, but we can't charge someone without evidence," she said. It made me frustrated and even more afraid. Deep down, I felt we were all ignoring something obvious. On the same day, I saw the man again as he was returning home with my son. He was standing on the corner, bag in hand, looking across the street. It didn't seem to be selling anything. He just stood there, motionless, as if he was waiting. It was the last time I saw him, but what happened that night was something that made me shiver until today. That night, something made me uneasy. I can't explain it, but the air inside seemed to be heavy, as if something was wrong. Waited for my son to sleep and sat on the sofa in the living room, looking out of the window. The street was quiet, quieter than usual. It was almost midnight when I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was my head, but then I heard again, closer and drawn, as if someone were carrying something heavy. My heart shot. I turned off the light in the room and hid behind the curtain, trying to peek through the window without being seen. It was then that I saw him. The man with the bag was standing in front of my house. He did nothing, just looked out the window as if he knew I was there. I could barely breathe. The bag was next to him, leaning on the ground, and seemed more full than before. He stood still for a time that seemed like an eternity, and then without warning, took the bag and began to walk back down the street as if nothing had happened. I wanted to call the police, but what was I going to say? What man with a bag was standing in my street? They would never take it seriously. I spent the whole night awake, listening to every sound and looking out of the window. When it was light, he had disappeared. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling that I needed to do something. I could not ignore it anymore. I decided to talk with the neighbors and ask if anyone else had seen the man the night before. To my surprise, some people also reported hearing footsteps during the early morning hours, but no one had seen anything. When I mentioned the man in the bag, some seemed uncomfortable, as if they knew who I was talking about, but did not want to admit. An older neighbor, Donna Rosa, said something that made me even more scared. He's not new here. I've seen this man before, years ago, when another child disappeared. It made me shiver. How had he been there before? I asked what she knew, but Donna Rosa didn't want to talk much. She only said that at the time, no one had connected the dots, and the case was never solved. I had that lump in my throat all day, trying to put the pieces together. It made no sense for him to be there, near the square, watching the children, as if he was waiting for something. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen did not leave me alone. Still, the man seemed to have disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. I didn't know if this was a relief or the beginning of something even worse. The following days were marked by a strange silence in the neighborhood. The children were taken home by their parents, and the matter of Sophia's disappearance began to cool down. But I could not forget what I had seen that night. I decided to take another look at the square and around the school, just to see if I could find something. I walked around the places where we used to see the man, but he wasn't there. It was only when I passed near a trail that led to an abandoned land that something caught my attention. On the ground, near some bushes, I saw a piece of colored plastic. I took it and realized that it was part of a toy very similar to those he used to give to children. My heart sped, but I kept walking. Further on, I saw something else, a crumpled pack of candy, those cheap candies he used to offer. It was as if someone had left a trail leading into that ground. I wanted to leave, but something inside me told me that I needed to see what was there. I entered slowly, trying not to make noise. The ground was full of tall bush and scattered garbage. It was when I saw something that made me freeze. There was a pile of bags just like the one he was carrying. Some were torn, and what I saw inside them made me run out without looking back. Until today, I can't say what it was exactly, but there was something there, something that should not be. Ran home without stopping, with my heart pounding and hands shaking. I closed the door behind me and leaned in trying to catch my breath. I didn't tell anyone what I saw on the ground. I didn't know how to explain, and honestly, I was afraid that no one would believe me. I spent the rest of the day looking out the window, hoping to see the man in the bag again, but he didn't show up. The neighborhood was silent, as if it was holding a secret that no one wanted to admit. My mind was a mess. Was he still around? Has he gone away for good? And what was inside those bags? At night, something strange happened. I heard footsteps again, as in that other morning. I went to the window with my heart in my throat, but I didn't see anyone. The steps stopped in front of my house, and for a moment I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. Didn't want to sound crazy, and they probably wouldn't do anything without hard evidence. When the steps started to move away, I took courage to spy. The street was empty, but next to the gate there was a bag. It was identical to the one he carried, crumpled and filled. I could not move for a few seconds. Finally, I had the courage to open the door and take a look. The bag was empty, but inside there was a crumpled note with something written. "Do you also like sweets?" My vision was clouded, and for a moment I thought I would faint. Back inside the house running, locking the door and checking all the windows. My heart was beating so fast I could hardly think. Who had left that note? Was it him? Or someone trying to scare me? I sat on the floor of the room, staring at the door as if I expected something or someone to come in at any moment. It was the first time I felt real fear, as if danger was not just a distant idea, but something that was surrounding me. Couldn't sleep that night. I stood in the room, all lights on, trying to hear any noise outside. But everything was quiet, too quiet. When the sun finally rose, it seemed that the weight of the ticket had doubled. I decided not to tell anyone about it. I still don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to believe that it was real. In the days that followed, the man with the bag never appeared. The square was full of children again, and the neighbors began to relax, as if everything had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't finished. To this day, every time I see a big bag, I feel my stomach turn and my heart speed. Because deep down, I know he's still out there. The van that never leaves. I remember well the day I first saw that van. It was a morning like any other, and I was leaving my daughter at school. The parking lot was full of parents hurried, children running to not miss the schedule, and that typical buzz on Monday. It was then that I noticed the white van parked across the street. She looked new, with dark windows and no sticker or sign of who belonged to her. Did not give much importance at the time. I thought it was just another car, but something about it stayed in my head. Perhaps it was the fact that, unlike the other vehicles, she seemed to be there for no reason. There was no one coming down from it, no child, no adult. Just parked still. In the following days, I began to notice that the van was always there. In the morning when I left my daughter, and in the afternoon when I went to pick her up. Always in the same position, as if it were part of the landscape. What bothered me most was that I never saw anyone entering or leaving it. Some mothers at the school gate also started commenting on the van. "It's strange, don't you think?" one of them said while we were waiting for the children. I agreed, but neither of us knew what to do. She was not parked in a forbidden place. There were no signs that something illegal was happening. Even so, that vehicle started to make me restless, as if I was watching everything without being noticed. A week later, the van was still there, parked in exactly the same place. This time, when I passed in the morning, I saw something different. The driver's window was slightly lowered. I tried to spy while driving, but could not see anyone. The interior seemed empty, which only added to the strangeness. I started to become obsessed with the idea that something was wrong. I talked to other parents, and many had also noticed the van, but no one could tell who it belonged to. Some mothers even said they had alerted the police, but apparently nothing illegal was found. "Maybe it's just someone waiting for someone commented, but it didn't seem convincing. Who would stand there every day for hours without any clear reason?" That afternoon, when I went to pick up my daughter, something happened that really moved me. A girl of about 7 or 8 years old ran past me, wide-eyed, holding her mother's arm tightly. I heard the mother asking what had happened, and the girl answered, almost crying, "The man in the van offered me sweets." My stomach turned. I automatically looked at the street, but the van was no longer there. It seemed that she had disappeared at the exact moment when the girl ran to tell her mother. Panic began to spread among the parents at the gate, and some called the police again. But when the officers arrived, there was no sign of the van or the driver. It was as if he had never been there. After this episode, the atmosphere around the school changed completely. Parents spent more time at the gate, waiting for the children and watching any suspicious movement. I started arriving early, parked the car in front of the school, and kept an eye on every vehicle that passed. The white van seemed to have disappeared, but not the feeling of restlessness. No matter how many days went by without a sign of her, it was as if we all knew she could appear again at any moment. My daughter, who until then did not understand the reason for all this concern, began to ask me why I seemed so nervous. I just said that I was taking care of her, but inside I felt something very wrong was about to happen. One morning, 2 weeks after the incident with the girl, as I was leaving my daughter at school, there she was again. The same white van, standing in the same place with darkened windows. My heart popped out. Parked my car a little further ahead and watched from afar, trying to see any sign of movement. After a few minutes, I realized that I was not the only one who had noticed. Some parents were also watching discreetly, whispering to each other. I decided to take my phone and take a picture of the van to have some proof if necessary. When I pointed the camera and started to adjust the focus, the van suddenly pulled out of place, as if the driver knew exactly what I was doing. The van accelerated so fast that, for a moment, I was paralyzed with my phone still in hand. When I finally recovered, I tried to write down the plate, but I couldn't. The reflection of the light and the speed with which it left made everything difficult. Other parents saw the same scene and began to crowd around, nervously commenting, "This is not normal." "He knew we were watching," someone said. We decided at that moment to call the police again, reporting the suspicious behavior and the driver's attempt to escape. Some parents mentioned the girl's incident and asked that the police take it seriously this time. The officers promised to increase surveillance around the school, but that was not enough to calm anyone down. That night, as I put my daughter to sleep, she said something to me that froze my spine. "Mom, I saw the van again today, but near the playground." My mind started running. The playground was on the other side of the school, a less crowded area surrounded by trees. I asked if she had seen anyone leave the van or talk to the children, but she just shook her head. "No, but it seemed like I was waiting for someone." That phrase didn't come out of my head. I spent the night looking out the window, with all lights off, trying to see any movement on the street. I didn't see anything, but that feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. The next day, I arrived early at school, determined to observe everything more closely. I parked my car strategically so that I could see the parking lot and the surrounding street without being noticed. For almost half an hour, nothing happened. The movement was the same as always. Children entering, parents saying goodbye in a hurry, and the constant sound of cars passing. That's when I noticed, by the corner of my eye, something familiar. There was the van, parked a little further than usual, almost hidden behind a line of cars. My breath became heavy, and I felt frozen in place. Even from a distance, it could be felt that she was there for a reason, waiting. I was watching, trying to control my anxiety. At one point, I saw a child run along the sidewalk, right next to the van. The side door slid a little, slowly, as if being opened quietly. It was enough to make me jump out of the car without even thinking. I ran towards the child, calling her by name, although I had no idea who she was. The girl stopped and looked at me, frightened, as the van door closed suddenly with a bang. It was so fast that when I looked again, the vehicle was already leaving, disappearing in traffic. My heart was racing, and I could barely speak. I took the girl by the hand and led her to the school entrance. I didn't know what to do, but I felt that at that moment I might have avoided something terrible. When I left the girl at the entrance of the school, I started to explain to the staff what had just happened. I was so nervous that my words were running out, but I managed to describe the van and how it seemed to be trying to attract the child. They listened carefully and made sure that they reported to the board and authorities. Meanwhile, I started to wonder why that van kept coming back, even with all the attention it was already getting. It was as if the driver knew exactly when and where to act, as if he was always one step ahead. That feeling of helplessness was unbearable. On the way home, my head was a mess. I began to notice that the van appeared more often at times when the movement was less. Too early, before the main flow of parents and children, or late in the afternoon, when almost everyone had already left. The police did not seem to be taking the situation seriously, but parents were increasingly alert. Some even started taking turns to monitor the school's surroundings. Despite this, No one could identify the driver or understand how he disappears so quickly. It was as if the van had a pattern that only he knew, and this made me even more suspicious that something very serious was about to happen. That night, I decided to share what had happened in a group of parents on WhatsApp. I explained about the van, the sliding door, and the strange behavior of the driver. The reaction was immediate. Some parents were extremely worried, but others still thought it was overkill. It may be just a coincidence, someone wrote. However, a mother sent me a private message saying she had also seen something similar last week. She said that, when picking up her daughter in the late afternoon, noticed the van stopped near the playground, but did not pay much attention at the time. Now I'm starting to think it wasn't my paranoia, she said. That just confirmed what I had already feared. This van wasn't just passing through. It was waiting. The next day, I woke up with a weight on my chest, as if something was out of place. I took my daughter to school early and decided to wait for a while, watching the surroundings of the car. It was when, again, I saw the van parked, but in a different place, almost at the end of the street, partially hidden by a tree. Something inside me knew that it was a coincidence. I took my phone and took several pictures this time, making sure to capture as much detail as possible. While doing this, I had the feeling that someone inside the van was watching me. The feeling was so strong that for a moment I thought I saw a subtle movement in the driver's window. I didn't wait to confirm. I left before anything could happen, but still I couldn't get rid of the feeling of being followed. When I got home, I went straight to the computer. I decided to research similar cases in the region or even in other cities. I found some creepy similar stories. White vans being seen near schools, reports of drivers offering candy or toys, and in some cases, missing children. But the pattern was always the same. The vans disappeared without leaving a trace, and no one could ever identify the responsible. That made me even more uneasy. I started to think that maybe we were dealing with something much bigger, something the police weren't prepared to investigate or just didn't want to see. In the late afternoon, while I was waiting for my daughter to leave school, there she was again. The van had come back, this time parked in a location that was not so obvious but still visible. I decided I would not ignore. Took my cell phone, called the police, and explained the situation, begging them to send someone immediately. To my surprise, this time they took it more seriously. Within minutes, 2 cars arrived. As the police officers approached the van, I watched from afar, feeling my heart almost coming out of my mouth. They knocked on the driver's door, but there was no answer. They opened the side door and nothing. The van was completely empty, as if it had never been used. No sign of driver, objects, or anything suspicious. It was as if the van was there only to confuse or scare. The police officers stood there for a while, talking to each other, looking as confused as I did. They inspected the vehicle from top to bottom, but apparently found nothing that indicated a crime. After a few minutes, one of them came to me to ask some questions. I explained everything I had seen in the last few days. The times that the van appeared, the incident with the sliding door, and the fact that the driver seemed to disappear whenever someone tried to approach. He listened carefully, but what he said next only increased my frustration. Without concrete evidence or something illegal inside the van, there is not much we can do. We will monitor the area, but this may be just coincidence. Coincidence? It was impossible to believe that. After the police left, I stood in the school parking lot, looking at where the van had been. As much as I wanted to move on with my life and pretend that everything was normal, something told me it wasn't over. And I was right. That same night, as I put my daughter to sleep, I heard a noise outside, as if a car had stopped in front of my house. Went to the window with the lights off and saw. The van was there, parked across the street with the lights on. For the first time, I saw a clear shadow moving in the driver's seat. My entire body froze. Before I could do anything, the van lights went out, and she disappeared into the darkness as if she had never been there. The feeling of being observed. I've never been easy to scare, but something about this situation still gives me the chills. When I moved to the apartment in the city center, everything seemed perfect. It was close to work, had good restaurants nearby, and I finally felt independent. At first, I didn't even notice the details around me. The busy streets, the constant noise of cars and people, was just part of the routine. But after a few weeks, I started to notice something strange. Every time I came home at night, there was always a man standing on the sidewalk across the street. He did nothing, just stood there, leaning on a pole or sitting on the bench in the square. I thought it was just a local resident, someone who liked to spend time outdoors and did not give much importance. But as the days went by, I began to realize that he was there more often than he should have been. No matter what time I arrived, he was there. Sometimes when I glanced at it, it seemed like he was watching me. It wasn't a direct look, but you could feel it, you know? Like when you feel someone staring at you, but try to pretend that you didn't notice. One night, I passed him closer and noticed that he was wearing the same clothes, a dark coat, a cap that hid part of his face, and worn shoes. Still, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just someone with no place to go, and I was being paranoid. Things started getting really weird a few weeks later. I left work one night later than usual. The city center was already much more empty, and the silence made everything more frightening. As I walked home, I noticed that he was there again, standing in the same place as always. This time, I felt an instant shiver. It was not just his presence, but the way he seemed to be waiting. The street was deserted, and it was exactly where I expected it not to be. I sped up the pace and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't help looking over my shoulder. He didn't move, but I felt like his eyes followed me until I turned the corner. The next night, I decided to change my route. Instead of going through the main street, I went by an alternative path, less illuminated, but that left me closer to the building. At first I felt relieved because he was not there, but when I approached the entrance of my building, I saw a shadow in the corner of the sidewalk. It was him, standing still, as if he already knew I would come that way. My heart shot, and I entered the building as fast as I could. I locked the door of my apartment and peeked out the window for a while, but I couldn't see it anymore. At that moment, I started to wonder if it was really a coincidence or if he was following me. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I was exaggerating. Maybe he lived around there or had a completely harmless reason for being in those streets. But something inside of me could not accept this explanation. I decided to pay more attention. During the day, it seemed that nothing strange happened. The street was busy, full of people coming and going, and I even felt kind of silly for being so paranoid. But that night, everything changed again. When I came home, he was not on the sidewalk as usual. Immediately I felt relief, but something still bothered me. The silence seemed heavier, almost as if it was a warning. When I got to the door of my building, I saw something that made my blood freeze. On the floor, right next to the door, there was a folded piece of paper. Picked up carefully, looking around to see if anyone was around. The note was short and written in a shaky handwriting. "I like to see you walk." My heart shot, and my hands began to tremble. I ran into the building, and went up the stairs to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I stood there leaning back, trying to understand what was happening. Who had left that note? How did you know I lived there? And more importantly, why me? After that note, my sleep was never the same. I locked not only the door of the apartment, but also the window of the living room, despite being on the 4th floor. Any noise from outside made me stand up and peep through the curtains. I decided to start changing my schedules and routes back home, thinking that it might lose him if he was really following me. In the early days, it seemed to work. I didn't see the man on any of my walks anymore, but deep down, I knew that was just a pause. The feeling of being watched did not leave me alone. Even in broad daylight, it seemed that someone was following me with their eyes, even when the street was full. One night, while I was trying to distract myself watching TV, I heard something in the hallway of the building. It was slow steps, as if someone were walking from one side to the other. My mind went straight to the worst-case scenario. Took my phone and went to the door, trying to hear better. The steps stopped right in front of my apartment. I stood still, holding my breath, while waiting for the next sound. Suddenly I heard a slight scratch, as if someone was passing their fingernail through the door. My heart seemed to explode. I called the concierge, but the doorman said there was no one in the building. When I finally created the courage to look through the peephole, the corridor was empty. After that episode, I decided that I could no longer ignore what was happening. The next day, I told a close friend everything, including the note and the episode of the steps in the corridor. She advised me to file a report, but I knew it wouldn't be taken seriously. What did I have? Just a strange note and the feeling of being watched. Even so, the conversation gave me some courage. When I came home that night, I decided to take a walk around the block before entering the building, trying to check if there was anything or anyone suspicious nearby. It was then that I saw something that made me freeze. Across the street, leaning against a pole, there he was again. This time he did not try to disguise that he was watching me. The man stood, his hands in his coat pockets, looking directly at me. The brightness of the light from the pole partially illuminated his face, but it was enough to notice the discreet and disturbing smile he kept. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs seemed to be locked. Finally, I managed to move and entered the building hurriedly, climbing the stairs almost without breathing. As I locked the door to my apartment, I heard footsteps again in the hallway. I didn't have the courage to look through the peephole this time. Just sat on the floor, leaning against the door, with my heart pounding and tears running down my face. The next morning, I decided not to come home straight from work. Took my things and went to the house of my friend, the same one that had advised me before. I told her about what happened the night before, and she offered to stay there for as long as necessary. I accepted at the time, although it felt strange to leave my apartment. As I spent the day in her home, fear began to be replaced by a false sense of security. Thought that perhaps, being away, I could finally breathe and understand the situation more clearly. But this did not last long. When I came back to the apartment the next day to pick up some clothes, everything seemed normal. The building was quiet and the hallway was empty. However, upon entering the apartment, I noticed something different. My door was closed, but the latch seemed to have been moved. There were no clear signs of a break-in, but something seemed out of place. I walked in slowly, shaking my hand as I held the key, and found a new note on the floor, right in the middle of the room. It was not bent like the previous one, but it seemed to have been left there on purpose, as if someone wanted me to see it as soon as I entered. The words in it were short and direct. "You thought you could hide?" At that moment, my legs were weak, and I almost dropped the note on the floor. The idea that someone had entered my apartment while I was away made me scared. I quickly locked the door and started checking every corner of the place, even though it was not safe to be there alone. I looked under the bed, inside the cupboards, behind the curtains, but there was no one. Still, the feeling that someone had been there was undeniable. I called my friend, almost unable to form the words, and told about the note. She insisted that I leave immediately and go straight to the station. On the way to the police station, I felt myself being followed even in broad daylight. He looked over his shoulder every few steps, but saw no one. When I finally arrived, I explained the whole situation to the police officer on duty. He listened carefully, but was clear in saying that without hard evidence it would be difficult to act. They filed the report, but there was not much they could do. I left there frustrated, but determined not to return to my apartment. I decided to stay at my friend's house for a few more days. However, even far away, the feeling of being watched did not disappear. That phrase on the note echoed in my head. Did you think you could hide? After a few days at my friend's house, things seemed calmer. I avoided thinking about the apartment and the man who followed me. But even then, I couldn't feel completely safe. Every time I went out to buy something, or even take a walk, the feeling of being watched came back with full force. No matter where I was, it seemed that there were eyes following me, hidden in some corner. I tried to ignore it, but my friend realized that something still bothered me. She suggested that maybe it was time I thought about moving away and forget what had happened. But the night I made that decision, something happened that made me realize that simply moving wouldn't solve the problem. We were having dinner in the room when we heard a noise coming from outside. My friend went to the window and gave me a look. When she came back, her face was pale. "There's a man standing across the street, looking over here," she said in a trembling voice. My whole body froze. I went to the window and even tried to prepare. What I saw left me paralyzed. There he was, same dark coat, same posture. He didn't move, but knew I was looking. He was showing me that he knew where I was, as if to remind me there was nowhere to run. That night was a nightmare. We were locked in my friend's house, with all the lights off, trying not to make noise. We called the police, but when the officers arrived, the man was no longer there. They went around the neighborhood, but found nothing suspicious. Before they left, they said the same thing as always. Without evidence or something concrete, there was not much to do. After they left, the silence in the house seemed deafening. We sat on the couch, waiting for the slightest sign that he could come back, but the night passed without further incident. Still, none of us could sleep. The next morning, we decided to go back to my apartment to pick up the last things I had left behind. My friend insisted on coming with me, and I was grateful that I didn't have to come back alone. When we got there, everything seemed normal, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. We opened the door and went straight into the room. As I picked up my clothes, my friend called me from the room. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of panic. When I went there, I saw what had made her freeze. Another note stuck on the inside of the door that we had just unlocked. "You'll never get rid of me." At that moment, I felt a cold running through my spine, as if someone was watching me at the exact moment. My friend was paralyzed, holding the note with trembling hands, while I tried to think of something rational to do. But the truth was that there was no logical explanation. How did that note stop there? We had just entered, and the door was locked when we arrived. It was impossible that someone had put that inside without us noticing. I took the note, trying not to panic, but every word seemed stuck in my mind as a direct threat. Whoever it was knew exactly how to get at me. We decided to leave the apartment immediately. I left everything behind. Nothing seemed more important than leaving it alive. That night we went back to my friend's house, but none of us could relax. Each sound sounded louder. Each shadow seemed to move. I knew he was close somehow. And to make matters worse, a question kept pounding in my head. How could he always be one step ahead? I did not sleep that night, nor the following. A few days later, I decided to move away to another city, but even far away, I still feel like I was watching, lurking, waiting for the right time to approach again. The notes in the closet. At first, I thought it was just a joke. It was a normal Wednesday, and I had just come out of chemistry class. I went to my closet in the corridor to get the history books, as I did every day. When I opened it, I saw a folded paper right on top of my things. I thought it was some leaflet or something someone had put there by mistake. But when I opened, I saw a short and strange message. I know who you are. The letter was simple, made with a black pen, without any drawing or signature. Laughed at that and thought it was some stupid prank from another student. I threw the paper in the trash bin in the hallway and went on with my day without thinking too much. In the following days, there was nothing different, and I had already forgotten about the note. But the next week, it happened again. This time, the paper was folded and stuck inside the closet door, as if someone had made sure to make it visible. The message was more direct. I liked what you were wearing yesterday. That's when I started to feel discomfort. Whoever it was seemed to be watching me. That day, I went home thinking about who could be doing it. Maybe it was some colleague trying to provoke me, but something in the way the note was written seemed too strange. On Friday of that same week, I found another note. This time, it was right in the middle of my things, on top of the notebooks that I was sure were organized when I left the closet in the morning. The message said, "You look tired today. Did you sleep badly?" That phrase made me cold. I had really slept badly the night before, but how would anyone know that? I looked at the note for a few minutes, trying to understand what was happening. I started noticing more people around me, watching if someone seemed to be staring at me or paying too much attention to me. But everyone seemed normal, busy with their own lives. I didn't know if I was getting paranoid or if it really was more than a joke. I told a close friend about the tickets, but he laughed and said it was probably just someone trying to scare me. "You're giving it too much attention." "Who knows, maybe it's just someone trying to flirt," he joked. I wanted to believe it was something so harmless, but the idea didn't make sense. If it was a joke or something like that, why hadn't anyone revealed themselves? And why were the messages so personal? I decided to ignore, but deep down, that discomfort only grew. It was as if I was being watched and could not concentrate on classes or after-school training. The following week, the tickets started to get even more specific. One of them said, "You spend a lot of time in the library. You like to study alone, don't you?" I hadn't told anyone that I had spent my last afternoons in the library trying to finish a biology paper. It was at that moment that I realized that whoever was leaving the tickets really watched me closely. I started to feel exposed, as if there was no place where I could be alone. I mentally reviewed everything I did throughout the day, trying to remember any strange faces or behavior that could give me a clue of who I was, but nothing made sense. Every day was the same, and no one looked suspicious. That night when I got home, I tried not to think about it too much. I went straight to my room, as I always did, but when I approached the study table, I noticed something strange. There was a little paper folded over my notebook. My heart shot up immediately because I knew I hadn't left it there. I opened the note with shaking hands, and the message was short but clear. "You look great when you are focused." At that moment, I realized the situation was much more serious than I thought. Someone had been inside my house. After finding that note, I panicked. I searched my room for signs that someone might have entered, but there was nothing out of place except the note. I went to my mother, trying to explain what had happened, but she didn't seem to believe it. Said I probably had put the paper there and forgot. I insisted that it was not the case, but she thought I was overreacting. I went back to the room, locking the door this time, but the idea that someone might have come in while I was not scared me. That night was long. Every sound in the house sounded louder, and I couldn't sleep. The next day, I arrived early at school to see if anything strange happened. I opened my locker slowly, my stomach turned, and there was another note. The message was more disturbing than any other so far. "I loved the shirt you wore to sleep yesterday." My blood froze. It was no longer just a joke. Whoever it was knew details that nobody should know. I ran to the nearest bathroom, feeling as if the air had disappeared. I stood there for a while, trying to control my breath and thinking about who could be behind it. What scared me the most was that this person seemed to know everything about me, as if I was everywhere at once. That afternoon, after school, I decided not to go straight home. I went to a nearby park, trying to put my thoughts in order. Whoever it was not only was watching me, but also knew details of my routine that only someone very close could know. I started to suspect everyone. Friends, colleagues, even the teachers. I couldn't trust anyone. While I was sitting on the bench, I felt my phone vibrate. An anonymous message appeared. "I also like this park. Quiet place, isn't it?" I looked around, trying to find someone who could have sent that, but there was nothing strange. Just people walking or reading, like any other day. But the message was clear. This person knew where I was, even at that moment. I came home determined to tell my father. Maybe he took it more seriously than my mother. But before I could explain, I heard a sound coming from my room. It was a noise of broken glass. I ran there and found my shattered window. There was no one around, and the street looked normal, but in the middle of my room floor there was another note. This was different. The handwriting was hastily written, almost scribbled, as if it had been written in haste. He said, "You cannot hide." That was the last straw. I had no more doubts that this person was close, perhaps much more than I imagined. After finding that note, my mind went into total chaos. I locked the door to my room and started calling my dad, but my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to dial. When he finally answered, I explained what was happening, trying to sound calm, but the panic was in my voice. He came home immediately. As soon as he arrived, he examined the room and the broken window. He seemed worried but tried to keep his composure. Decided to call the police and report the incident. While we waited for the arrival of the officers, I sat on the couch, trying to understand how someone had come so close to me without me noticing. The police arrived about half an hour later. They asked some basic questions and inspected the room, but as I feared, they found no concrete evidence. The note was taken for analysis, but one of the officers made it clear that without witnesses or something more solid, it would be difficult to do anything. Before I left, one of them told me to stay alert and call if something else happened. Those words didn't comfort me at all. That night, I slept on the sofa in the living room with all the lights on. But even with my father at home, I could not help feeling that I was still being watched. The next morning, I decided that I could not continue living like this, always looking over my shoulder. I asked my father to install extra locks on my bedroom door and cover the broken window with a wooden board until it could be fixed. Even with these measures, the feeling of vulnerability did not disappear. On the way to school, I tried to convince myself that maybe it was all over. Maybe the person in charge was scared of the police. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. When I got to school, I went straight to the closet, hesitant to open. My heart popped as I saw that once again there was a note inside. This time, it was not just put in the closet but stuck with tape at the bottom, as if the person wanted to make sure I would find it. The message said, "Did you think calling the police would stop me? I'm closer than ever." Closed the closet at the time, so hard that some colleagues looked at me scared. Panic took hold of me. Whoever it was knew everything, even the police. And the worst part was that he seemed to enjoy it. That afternoon, I could not concentrate on anything. During the classes, I felt as if everyone around me knew what was happening, as if they were watching me too. Paranoia was consuming me. I decided that I could not ignore it anymore. I went to the director's office and told them about the tickets, the broken window, everything. He listened to me seriously, but seemed as lost as I am. He promised to check the school's security cameras, but I knew it would be useless. Whoever was doing this was meticulous, always one step ahead. When I came home, I found my father on the phone, discussing with the security company to install cameras in the apartment. It was comforting to see that he was taking the situation seriously, but this did not diminish the dread I felt. Later that night, as I was getting ready to sleep, I heard a noise coming from the room. It was the sound of something scratching at the front door. My father ran to check, but when he opened the door there was no one. Just a note, taped with tape on the outside. He took it and read it in silence before handing me over. The words were short, but enough to chill me to the bones. "You are always alone, even when you think you are not." After that note, I could not sleep. Every sound in the house made me alert. I spent the whole night sitting in the living room, with the lights on and the phone in my hand, ready to call the police at the slightest sign of something strange. My father tried to convince me to rest, but how could anyone rest after receiving a message like that? The worst was that she was right. Even with my father around, I felt like I was alone in this. Whoever it was seemed to have total control of the situation, and I had no idea how to deal with it. The next morning my father decided I should not go to school until everything was settled. I agreed, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Even at home, fear accompanied me. Around noon, while I was trying to distract myself with a game on the computer, I heard the sound of notification from my phone. When I looked, it was a message from an unknown number. She said, "I liked your shirt today." At that moment, I realized I was not safe anywhere. I looked around, trying to locate any camera or any sign that I was being watched, but there was nothing. The feeling of impotence was suffocating. Determined not to stand still any longer, I ran to my father and showed him the message. He was as alarmed as I was and immediately called the police again. This time they took it a little more seriously. 2 officers came to our house, asked detailed questions, and asked to see the note and messages. When I handed the phone to them, I felt a weight come off my shoulders, as if finally someone could do something. But the relief was short-lived. They explained that anonymous messages from temporary numbers were almost impossible to track. All they could do was recommend that I change my routine and maybe even leave town for a while. After the cops left, my mind was on fire. Change my routine? Leave town? How would that solve something if this person seemed to know everything I did? It was as if I was always one step ahead, anticipating every move of mine. To make matters worse, that night when I went to the kitchen to get water, I saw something through the window. Outside on the sidewalk, there was a person standing. It was dark, and the light from the pole didn't really illuminate my face, but the posture was familiar. It was as if he knew I was looking. I was frozen, unable to move, until my father entered the kitchen, and in a blink of an eye, the figure disappeared into the darkness. After seeing that person on the sidewalk, I decided I couldn't continue like this. I talked to my father, and he suggested that we go spend a few days at the house of a relative in another city. I agreed, although I didn't think running away would solve the problem. The next day, we started packing our things. While I was stuffing my backpack, I decided to take a last look in my school locker to see if anything had been left there. Didn't want to take any more surprises with me. I arrived at the school in the late afternoon, when the building was almost empty. I walked through the halls in silence, feeling a weight in the air that was not normal. When I opened the locker, there was no note this time, but something even worse. At the bottom, tied with tape, there was a picture of me. It was recent, probably taken that week. I was walking down the street carrying my backpack. But what scared me the most was the detail. In the reflection of a shop window next to me, I could see a shaded figure clearly following me. Whoever it was, he wasn't just leaving notes. He was always there, closer than I wanted to believe. I held the photo in my hands for a few seconds, without being able to breathe properly. I looked around, trying to convince myself that I was alone in the corridor, but the feeling that someone was watching me became stronger. I folded the photo in a hurry, put it in my pocket, and closed the closet tightly, maybe more than I should. As I started walking towards the exit, I heard footsteps. They were slow, echoing in the empty corridor. I turned back, but there was no one. Still, the sound continued, closer and closer. Panic took hold of me, and I ran to the exit without looking back again. When I got home, I showed the picture to my dad. He was silent for a moment, but I could see that he was just as scared as I was. He said that there was no more to think. We would leave that very night. While he organized things, I stayed in the room, trying to understand how it had come to this point. Looked out the window from time to time, hoping to see something or someone outside. It was then that I noticed something on the edge of the sidewalk. An envelope. I ran down to get it, even though I knew it was a bad idea. Inside there was only one handwritten message: "You can't run away. I am always with you." After reading that message, I felt as if the ground had disappeared under my feet. I ran up to the apartment, holding the envelope as if it were concrete proof that I wasn't crazy. When I showed it to my dad, he finally lost his cool. He decided we couldn't wait another minute and started putting everything in the car. The idea was to drive to a distant relative's house without stopping. While he finished loading things, I stood at the bedroom window, looking down on the street. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It was already night when we finally left. The path was tense. My father drove in silence, while I looked at all the cars and figures on the road, trying to identify anything that seemed suspicious. But the road was empty. and for a moment I began to believe that we were actually escaping. When we finally arrived at my uncle's house, I started to feel safer. The place was far away, surrounded by trees, and it seemed impossible that anyone could find us there. But that morning, while I was trying to sleep, I heard something knock on the window of the room where I was. I looked carefully, and on the glass there was a note glued to the outside. The final sentence was simple, but it left me paralyzed. I said, "You cannot run away." The disappearance in the suburbs. I will never forget that week. It all started like any other, with nothing abnormal. Our neighborhood has always been quiet, the kind of place where you know all the neighbors by name and where people feel safe to leave their doors unlocked. But everything changed when Sarah disappeared. She was a classmate, quiet but very friendly. The day she disappeared, she had gone out for one of her night runs, something she did almost every day. I remember seeing her leaving school that day, with her hair tied to a ponytail and carrying the sports backpack. It seemed so normal, so routine. No one could have imagined that it would be the last time we would see her. The next day, the subject was already everywhere. Her parents called the police after she did not come home that night. At first, everyone thought she had just stayed at a friend's house without warning, but as the hours passed, it became clear that something was wrong. When they started checking the security cameras of the houses along the route where she used to run, things got even stranger. In one of the recordings, I could see Sarah running as usual, but a few meters back, there was a blurred figure, almost indistinguishable. Whoever it was seemed to be following her. It was as if someone was taking care not to be noticed, but the images were not clear enough to identify who he was. The neighborhood mood changed completely after that. Everyone started talking about the figure in the pictures. People speculated whether it was someone from outside or, worse, if it was someone who lived there among us. I remember hearing my parents whispering in the kitchen, saying they were afraid to let me go out alone, even if it was to go to school. The police did some rounds around the neighborhood, but it seemed that nobody knew anything. Everyone had a theory, but no concrete answer. Some houses started to install more cameras, and I began to avoid walking anywhere that was not well lit and busy. In the midst of all this tension, stories about strange messages began to emerge. Some classmates said that in the days before Sarah disappeared, they had received messages from an anonymous Instagram account. It was weird stuff like, "Do you think you're safe?" or "Everyone has secrets." At first, the messages seemed just spam or some stupid joke. But after the disappearance, it became impossible not to connect the dots. One of the girls in our class, Emily, said she had received a message the night before Sarah disappeared. The message said, "Do you know who will be next?" When she told that, no one else could think it was just a coincidence. After Emily told about the message, the paranoia only increased. Some of us started to look at our own social networks, looking for anything that might be connected. We found that the account sending these strange messages had no photo, name, or followers. It seemed to have been created only to spread these messages. The most frightening thing was that some of them mentioned specific things, like places we go or details of our routine. A close friend of Sarah's, Claire, said she received a message saying, "You will miss her." She received this message the same day that Sarah disappeared. The school principal called an emergency meeting, asking everyone to avoid going alone and go straight home after class. The police were involved, but they seemed to have little to work with. Each new information only made it more confusing, until something even weirder happened. One of the boys in the class, Mike, decided to respond to one of the anonymous account messages. He asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" The answer came almost instantly, "I'm closer than you think." This made everyone panic. It was as if this person wanted us to know that he was watching us, but at the same time he did not want to be discovered. After this response to Mike, no one else felt safe, not even inside the house. The messages started appearing more often, always in a threatening tone, but never enough to give a clear clue. It was then that a very strange thing happened to me. I had not received any message until then, but one night while doing homework, my phone vibrated. It was a direct message from an account I had never seen before. It said, "Did you see who was watching you today?" I froze at the time. I spent the whole day trying to avoid thinking about what was going on, and that message threw me back into panic. I tried to ignore it, but over the course of the night I received 2 more messages from the same account. The first one said, "Do you think you're safe inside?" And the second, "You should look out of the window." My heart popped. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call my father, but something was holding me back, maybe fear that he would not believe or think I was exaggerating. With much hesitation, I went to the window and peeked through the curtains. The street was dark and deserted, but something seemed wrong. There was no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. After looking out the window, I went back to bed trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't. The silence of the house seemed to suffocate me. Every few minutes, I checked my phone for new messages. I didn't get anything, but it just made everything more strange. I decided to open the profile of the account that had sent me the messages. It had no photos, no posts, and no followers. It seemed that she had been created only for that. Even so, there was something that caught my attention. The last time the profile was active, it was always minutes before I received the messages. This meant that the person was watching and writing in real time. The next morning, I went to school still in shock by what happened, but without telling anyone. When I arrived, the mood was even heavier than on other days. Everyone seemed to be talking about the messages. 2 more people had received similar texts to mine, and one of the colleagues said that the account now sent messages with specific phrases like, "I know what you did yesterday," or "That street you took last night didn't seem safe, right?" Each message seemed more intimate, as if whoever was following our every movement. And worst of all, no one had any idea who was behind it. That afternoon, things took an even more frightening turn. During the break, while I and some friends were talking about the messages, the director came into the room with a serious look and asked to speak with us. She said that authorities were monitoring the situation, but that no one should interact with the anonymous account. According to her, answering or trying to confront the person was only making things worse. But what really terrified us was what she revealed next. Another security camera from a house near the school had captured something. This time, it was not just a blurry figure. It was a silhouette, clearly standing on the sidewalk, watching the school from afar, as if choosing its next victim. When we returned to the classroom, everyone was restless. No one wanted to admit it, but it was clear that we all thought the same thing. This person was still around, and maybe even knew us. I started to watch my colleagues more closely. Was it someone from inside the school, or someone who went unnoticed by all of us? I couldn't concentrate on anything for the rest of the day, and it was when I came home that I noticed something even more disturbing. There was a folded note stuck with tape at the gate of my house. It just said, "You're asking the wrong questions." When I saw that note at the gate, I felt my heart go. I looked around, trying to see if there was anyone nearby, but the street was completely empty. I ran into the house, locked the door behind me, and went straight to my room. Sat in bed, holding the note in my hands, trying to understand what it meant. You're asking the wrong questions. What questions should I be asking? I was already thinking of all the possibilities. Who is the person behind the messages? How did she know so much about us? And most importantly, why was Sarah chosen? I started to mentally put together all the details, but nothing seemed to make sense. Meanwhile, my phone vibrated. It was another anonymous message from the account. This time it was different. It wasn't a threatening phrase or something generic. It was a picture. In the image, I could clearly see my house taken from outside, as if the person had just been there. My heart almost stopped. I opened the window, looking at the street again, but there was no one. The next message came seconds later. Is it getting clearer now? At that moment, I realized it was not just paranoia. This person was really watching me closely, and I had a feeling that the next step would be much more direct and scary. After receiving that message, I felt like I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. I tried to call my parents, but they would only come home later, and I didn't want to alarm them without a concrete explanation. So I decided to do what seemed most logical: call the police. I quickly explained what was happening, the messages, the ticket at the gate, and finally the photo of my house. The attendant seemed to take the situation seriously and said he would send a car to patrol the area. It gave me a little relief, but I still felt like the air around me was heavy, as if something was about to happen. While waiting for the car, I went to the room and locked all the doors and windows. But when I was closing the front window curtain, I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a person standing across the street, on the curb, almost covered by the shadow of a tree. Even from a distance, I could see that I was looking directly at my house. Could not distinguish details, but the posture was strange, too still. I blinked, trying to believe it was my imagination, but the figure was still there. I took my phone to take a picture, but before I could do that, the person turned around and disappeared into the darkness as if he had never been there. A few minutes after the figure disappeared, the car arrived. 2 officers came down and asked some questions, but I knew I didn't have much to say. They went around the neighborhood, lit up some alleys, and came back saying there was no one suspicious around. One of them tried to reassure me, saying that it was probably someone trying to play a trick, but it didn't make sense. Why would someone go so far, sending messages, leaving notes, taking pictures? After they left, I sat in the room with the lights on and my phone in my hand, feeling that at any moment something worse could happen. Later that night, as I tried to convince myself that I was safe, I received another message. It was a picture, but this time it wasn't from my house. It was from school. The photo showed the corridor where my closet was, and in the reflection of one of the windows, there was an indistinct shadow, as if someone was taking the picture from afar. Soon after, another message appeared. You finally realize that it's not just about Sarah, is it? That left me paralyzed. What did they mean by that? Was I also being targeted? And more importantly, how could this person be in so many places without being noticed? At that moment, I started to connect the dots and realized that this was much bigger than just Sarah's disappearance. I took my phone and started reviewing all the messages I received and heard from other colleagues about the strange messages. There was a pattern. All seemed directed to make us feel vulnerable, as if the person wanted us to realize that we were being watched all the time. But why? That was what I couldn't understand. I decided to check social networks again, and while browsing through the posts of my colleagues, I saw something that made me freeze. One of Sarah's friends had posted an old photo of her with the caption, "I hope you'll be back soon." In the comments, an anonymous account replied, "Do you think you know where she is?" Immediately I took a print and showed it to the police the next day. They said they were tracking the anonymous accounts, but it looked like whoever was using tools to make tracking more difficult. It just made things worse. I couldn't stop thinking that the same person who was texting us could be the one who took Sarah. What if she was alive? What if this person was using the messages to provoke us? Increasingly, it seemed that I was in a game that did not understand the rules, and who was playing against us knew exactly what he was doing. That night, as I was trying to organize my thoughts, I heard a strange noise coming from the yard. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard again, as if something was being dragged. Took my phone and with shaking hands, turned on the flashlight. I walked to the kitchen window, from where I could see the whole yard. There was nothing out there, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I quickly closed the curtain and went back to the room, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But before I could calm down, my phone vibrated again. Another anonymous message. "You should check the outside. Don't you think?" At that moment, I panicked. I didn't have the courage to leave, but I knew I needed to check. Took a knife in the kitchen and went to the front door. Opened slowly, lighting the backyard with the phone. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I turned to look at the gate, I saw something hanging on the latch. It was a folded piece of paper, tied with a piece of string. I carefully picked up the note and ran back inside before opening it. The message said, "You're next." My heart went wild, and I knew that it was past cyber threats. Whoever it was, he was close. Very close. After reading that note, I felt my body completely freeze. I locked all the doors and windows, checked every corner of the house, and stood in the room trying to decide what to do. I called the police again and explained about the ticket at the gate. This time, they promised to send a car to patrol the area at night. But even with that promise, I could not feel safe. It was as if that person wanted me to know that she could show up anytime, anywhere, and there was nothing I could do. Later, while trying to distract me by watching TV, my phone vibrated again. It was a new message from the anonymous account. "Are you afraid? I can feel it." The phrase made my skin crawl. It was no longer just a psychological game. This person seemed to feed on my dread. I decided to ignore and not respond, but then another message arrived. A photo of my house, taken from the street, showing my window with the lights on. At that moment, I realized the person was there, watching me in real time. I ran to the window, but the street was empty. It was as if the figure dematerialized in the air, always leaving only traces of its power over me. After receiving that photo, I decided that I could not be alone at home anymore. I called my parents and explained what was happening, insisting that they come back as soon as possible. While I waited, I stood in the middle of the room, where I could see all the entrances to the house, with my phone in hand and the lights on. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind in the trees, the crackling of the wood floor, even the hum of the refrigerator made me alert. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. The only thing I knew was that this person was playing with me and knew exactly how to manipulate me. When my parents arrived, I told them everything, including about the ticket at the gate and the last message with the photo of our house. My father immediately left to check the area, while my mother called the police again. He came back a few minutes later, saying that there was nothing or anyone suspicious, but we should spend the night on alert. This time the police had a car parked on our street corner, but I knew that would not be enough. It was as if this person was invisible, always one step ahead, and only appeared when he wanted me to know that he was there. That night, with the car parked around the corner, I thought I would finally have some peace. My parents tried to act normally, saying that the police were taking care of everything, but I knew they were nervous too. I went to my room, but couldn't sleep. I sat in bed, the light out, looking out of the window. The wooden board we had put up as protection seemed too fragile, and the idea that someone might be out there watching me made me scared. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a noise coming from outside. It was a low sound, as if someone was dragging something down the sidewalk. My heart shot, but I stood still, trying to hear better. The sound stopped for a moment, and then I heard something even more disturbing. 3 soft beats in my bedroom window. My body froze. I knew there could be no one there because of the height of the window, but the beats continued, rhythmic, as if they were calling me. Took my phone while shaking hands and sent a message to my father, who was in the next room. There is someone at the window. Seconds after sending the message, I heard my father get up in a hurry. He opened the door of my room and looked directly at the window. Without saying anything, he went to the room to get a flashlight and went out to check the outside. I was paralyzed, unable to move or even look at the window again. My heart was racing, and I could only hear the sound of the even louder beats now. They seemed almost deafening, but at the same time no one else seemed to hear them. My father came back after a few minutes, his face confused. "There's nothing out there," he said. "It's all quiet." But what he did not know was that, the moment he left, the beats stopped as if by magic. After he went back to his room, I decided I needed to check his phone. I opened the anonymous account messages, and there was a new notification. It was another picture, but this time it wasn't from my house or the street. It was a picture taken inside my room. The photo showed exactly where I was sitting in bed at that moment. My vision became blurred, and I felt a wave of panic take over me. Whoever it was, they were no longer outside. They were inside. After seeing that photo, I went into a complete panic. I ran to my parents' room, holding my phone and trying to explain what had happened, but the words came out of it. My father took the phone from my hand, and when he saw the picture, his face changed completely. Without wasting time, he took a gun that he kept in the closet and began to search the house. My mother tried to calm me down, but despair was stamped on her face too. I knew that at that moment, no one had control of the situation. Whoever it was playing with us. My father checked all the rooms, but he didn't find anyone. Nevertheless, he decided that we wouldn't stay there anymore. We left the house in the middle of the morning, straight to a hotel. The police were called again, and this time they took the situation more seriously. They isolated the house for an investigation, but what scared me most was what they found in my room. According to the officers, there were shoe marks on the dust from the window and on the floor next to the bed. There was no sign of forced entry, but the marks were fresh. Someone really was there in my room while I was sitting. To this day, I don't know how or why. I just know that after that night, I never came back to that house. The man in the park. When I was a child, my uncle loved to tell scary stories for me and my cousins. Whenever we were gathered at my grandparents' house, he would invent a new one, but there was one in particular that gave me chills. The story of Man in the Park. He said the man was a shadowy figure that roamed the park near home, watching children who left late or ventured too far. According to my uncle, the man of the park had eyes that looked empty and knocked on windows at night to scare those who did not obey the rules. To us children, that seemed just an exaggerated way of keeping us out of trouble, and we ended up laughing nervously, but never without a bit of fear. Over the years, the story became an internal joke within the family. Whenever we heard a strange noise at night or saw someone suspicious in the park, someone would say, "It must be the park man." Only at the time, no one had any idea how much more real it was than we imagined. It was only years later, already in adolescence, that I heard for the first time about an old case of disappearances in the neighborhood. My mother casually commented, while watching the news, that some children had disappeared in the past, and that the investigations never reached anywhere. She didn't even pay much attention to the subject, but I felt a shiver. Did my uncle's story have more to do with what we imagined? That night, after hearing about the disappearances, I could not stop thinking about my uncle's story. I started to gather pieces of memory, trying to remember exactly what he said about the park man. Some parts were blurry in my head, but others were crystal clear, like the detail of him always mentioning the window bangs. At the time, I thought it was just to scare us, but now that I think about it, his stories seemed more specific than mere inventions. I remember asking my mother days later if she thought it had any connection, but she just laughed and said that my uncle loved to make things up to scare us. However, a particular memory began to bother me. When I was about 8 years old, I spent a night at my grandparents' house. My room looked straight out to the backyard, which had a partial view of the park. I remember waking up at dawn with a sound that seemed to come from the window. It was not strong, but it was rhythmic, as if someone was beating lightly. At the time, I was paralyzed, afraid to look, because my uncle's story came to mind automatically. The next day I commented to him, and he laughed, saying, "It was the park man. He came to see if you were behaving." Everyone found it funny, but now looking back, that night never seemed so simple. After that memory comes back, you cannot ignore what you felt. It was as if something was pulling me to revisit that past, something I had tried to forget. I decided to ask my uncle directly about the stories he told. That weekend, during a family lunch, I picked him up alone and asked, "That story of the park man, did you make it up or was there something real behind it?" He got serious for a moment, something rare to him, and then replied, "I was counting on keeping you away from the park at night. You know, a dark place, dangerous." I tried to press, but he quickly changed the subject, as if not wanting to go into more detail. It only increased my curiosity. A few weeks later, on some afternoon, I was talking to my grandmother about things from childhood, and I mentioned the stories of my uncle. It was then that she said something that made me cold. She casually commented that when my uncle was younger, he and his friends were afraid to go to the park because I always heard stories about a man who followed children there. I asked her if she knew more about it, but she said it was just rumor, something that the adults of the time used to scare the kids. But the way she spoke, as if she didn't believe it entirely, made me uneasy. It was then that I decided to research more about the disappearances my mother had mentioned. I spent a whole night researching the disappearances in the neighborhood. Initially, I did not find anything very concrete, only vague mentions in local forums and some old news, already forgotten in time. But with more effort, I started to put pieces together. There were at least 3 documented cases of missing children in the 1980s, all in neighborhoods near ours. The pattern was frighteningly similar. All were between 7 and 10 years old and disappeared after being seen near the park. None of them were found, and the cases ended up being closed due to lack of evidence. This made me think, did the park man my uncle mentioned have anything to do with it? What really shook me was finding an account of a resident at the time, posted on a forum some years ago. He said that as a child, he always saw a strange man wandering around the park at dusk. According to him, the man had a posture that bothered, as if he was always watching something or someone. In the report, the resident mentioned hearing banging on the window some nights, but said it was probably from a frightened child's head. When I read this, I felt my stomach turn. The window bangs were the most constant detail in my uncle's stories. I began to wonder, did he know more than he admitted? I decided I needed to confront my uncle again. This time I was more direct. I waited until we were alone and showed him what I had found, the reports of disappearances and the text of the forum about the man in the park. He was silent for a few seconds, looking at the screen of my phone. Finally, he sighed and said, "I knew you would find out something." That phrase froze me. I asked what he knew, and he started to explain. He said that when he was younger, he and his friends used to go to the park at night, even though they knew they shouldn't. One night, they heard heavy footsteps and saw someone standing in the shade of a tree. They could not see the face, but the man seemed to be holding something like a big bag. They ran away, and after that night, they promised never to go there again. He said that shortly after, rumors began to surface about missing children, and that the parents of the victims always mentioned having seen a strange man near the park in the previous days. He never knew if the 2 events were connected, but that stuck with him, and that's why he started telling us the stories as a warning. I asked him if he thought the man they saw was responsible, but he just shrugged. I don't know, but I know something was wrong in that park. It always was. That answer didn't give me peace. On the contrary, it seemed that she only confirmed that there was something greater going on there. After that conversation, I became obsessed with the idea of finding out the truth. I decided to go back to the park, even though I knew it was something I had always avoided. I arrived there in the late afternoon, while the sun was still setting, and started walking on the stone paths that I used to avoid as a child. The place had a strange energy, a mixture of nostalgia and discomfort. The trees were tall and blocked much of the light, creating long and irregular shadows. Everything seemed calm, but at the same time every little sound, the rustling of leaves, a branch breaking in the distance, made my heart speed up. I passed by an old wooden bench, worn out by time, and remembered one of the stories my uncle told. He always mentioned that the park man liked to sit there and watch the kids play. It was just a story, right? But at that moment, everything seemed to connect in a disturbing way. I kept walking and came to a small abandoned shed in the back of the park, a place that I had never noticed before. The door was leaning against it, with a rusty chain hanging down, as if someone had tried to lock it, but failed. Something in me said to go away, but another part insisted on going in and seeing what was there. With trembling hands, I pushed the door of the shed. The smell of mold and old wood hit me at the time, and the place was almost completely dark, with only a few beams of light coming through the broken boards. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear the sound in my ears. Inside the shed was empty, except for some objects scattered on the floor. plastic bags, glass bottles, and something that seemed to be a pile of old blankets in the corner. It looked like a place that someone could have used to hide, or worse, to observe without being seen. While I tried to calm down, a detail caught my attention. On the wall, there were marks of something scratching, as if someone had scratched the wood with force. I got closer to try and understand and realized that they were drawings, rudimentary figures of children, made with what seemed to be charcoal. There was something disturbing about the simplicity of the strokes, as if they were made by someone obsessed. The worst came when I saw a small inscription just below one of the drawings, "Always watching." It was the same sentence I had read in the forum weeks before. At that moment, a loud noise of something falling behind me made my body freeze. When I heard the noise, my body was completely locked. I didn't have the courage to turn around immediately, but the feeling that someone was there with me was unbearable. My heart seemed to want to come out of the mouth, and I could barely breathe. Finally, I gathered forces and I turned slowly, with the phone in my hand, using a flashlight to illuminate what was behind me. The noise came from a corner near the door. One of the old blankets was on the floor, as if it had been knocked down or dragged. But there was no one there. Still, something seemed wrong. The light of the lantern trembled in my hand, and it was then that I realized. Beneath that fallen blanket, something shone lightly. I approached cautiously and lifted the cloth with my toe. Below it was a piece of broken glass. It looked like a piece of mirror, but dirty and dusty. When I saw it, I saw something that made my blood cold. On it, there were finger marks, as if someone had held the mirror recently. There was no way of knowing how long it had been there, but the idea that someone might be using that place to watch or hide scared me. Ran out of the shed, my heart pounding and the phone still in hand. The park, which before seemed calm, now had an oppressive atmosphere, as if each shadow hid something or someone. He looked around as he ran back to the main road, trying to convince me that he was alone. But the feeling of being watched was so strong that I would turn back sometimes, hoping to see someone following me. There was no one, or at least not that I could see. When I finally reached the entrance of the park, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, but something still didn't seem right. As I tried to laugh, my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen and saw that it was a message notification. It was not from anyone I knew. The message came from an unknown number and said only, "You found what I was looking for?" My whole body froze. There was no way that this could be a coincidence. I looked at the park one last time before running home, trying to understand how someone knew that I was there and what I had found. That message confirmed what I had already feared. My uncle's story was not just a scary tale. Someone or something was really behind it. When I got home, I closed all the doors and windows, because that would be enough to protect me. A message was still on my phone screen, as a reminder that whoever knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I showed a message to my mom, but she said it was probably just someone scaring me. My dad, on the other hand, got more serious. He told me what I was doing in the park and why I had started to move. That night I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept turning in bed, with the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I heard banging on my window. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the beats continued, soft, almost rhythmic, as if someone was waiting for an answer. My room was on the second floor, and the idea that someone could be out there left me paralyzed. Gathered enough courage to lift and open the curtain, but there was no one. Just a dark night. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was the wind or a tree branch. But before I could laugh, my phone vibrated again. The message said, "You remember the beats, don't you?" At that moment, I felt my whole body frozen. The message not only confirmed the beats, but also seemed connected to something deeper, something I had tried to forget. In childhood, window bangs were a constant part of my uncle's stories, but at that moment I realized they weren't just an invented detail. I remembered all the times when I woke up at dawn listening to those children when I was a child. At the time, I thought it was just my imagination, but now everything seemed to fit together in a scary way. Took my phone with tremendous hands and wrote back to the unknown number. "Who are you?" I waited for a response, but nothing came. I was up until dawn, unable to sleep. When the day finally cleared, I decided to go back to the park, this time with my father. I told him about the message, and although reluctant, he told me to follow. When we got to the shed, everything looked exactly like the night before. The place was empty, and there was no sign that someone had been there. But as they searched more closely, my father found something I had not seen before, an old notebook hidden among the blankets. The pages were stained and worn, but some were still legible. A phrase written several times came to light, "I see you. Always see." That was a drop of water. We got out of there as fast as possible, but to this day I feel that whoever wrote that never really left. The man in the parking. I always park in the same place after work. It was a corner of the university parking lot near the exit, where almost no one stopped because it was far from the main entrance. It makes sense to me. I was able to leave quickly, and the place was usually empty. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing something strange. Whenever I arrived at night, after school or work, there was a man leaning in a car a few meters from mine. He did nothing, just stood there with his hands in his pockets or crossed on his chest, staring straight ahead. At first, I managed to be just a student waiting for someone or maybe a neighbor. It was the kind of thing that makes you wonder if you're being paranoid. The man never said anything, never approached, but there was something in the way he looked. It wasn't casual, as if he was just lost in thoughts. It was direct, almost intentional. I decided to ignore it, but every time I got out of the car or went back to it, I felt that look burning my back. I avoided eye contact and pretended not to notice, but deep down it was bothering me. Some nights I thought about changing the parking spot, but it always ended up in the same place. It was more practical, I told myself. Now looking back, I should have listened to my instinct. One night, after a particularly tiring day, I returned to the parking lot a little later than usual. To my surprise, the man was not there. I felt an immediate rupture, as if I could finally relax. I walked to the car and noticed that the area was completely deserted. It was a strange feeling, but at the same time comforting not to have that look accompanying me as I got into the car. However, when I put the key in the ignition, I noticed something strange. The internal mirror was slightly displaced. I always adjusted it before leaving, and was sure that it was in the right position the last time I used the car. I stood still for a few seconds, looking around, trying to understand if someone had tampered with the vehicle. The next night, the man came back. He was leaning in the same car as always, with the same empty look, as if nothing had happened. This time, I could not avoid the discomfort. As it passed by, I felt a cold running through my spine. It seemed that he knew I had noticed something the night before. When I got into the car, I locked the doors immediately, something I never did. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there he was, still standing, but with his body slightly bent towards me. I could not take that from my head. Something was very wrong, but I still did not know it. The next night I decided to take a different route for the parking lot, trying to observe the location from a long distance before reaching my car. When I turned the corner and saw it again, leaning against the same car, I was sure that something was wrong. The parking lot was empty as always, and he looked alien, but the stare in the space ahead of him was disturbing. I tried to convince him that he had nothing to do with me, that I was imagining things. But why was he every night, always in the same place, never doing anything but watching? The tension was consuming me, and the idea of confronting him passed through my mind, but I soon discarded it. It made no sense to risk it. I got into the car quickly, locking the doors as the night before, turned on the engine and stood there for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, trying to get myself together before leaving. When I looked in the rearview mirror, he was closer. Not threatening enough, but clearly closer than before, standing at an angle that gave a direct view of my car. It was the first time he moved since he began to notice his presence. My throat got dry, and I could only think of getting out of there as soon as possible. I backed away and left, without looking back, but the discomfort accompanied me for the rest of the night. The next night, I decided not to park in the same place. I looked for a spot in another parking area near a more crowded building. Still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. When I finished my shift at work and went back to the car, I looked around before entering. I didn't see the man, and that should have calmed me down, but for some reason it only made me more restless. I got into the car, and before starting the engine, I noticed something strange. The passenger door was open, as if it had not been completely closed. It was impossible, because I always locked the car. My stomach turned. Carefully opened the passenger door to check. That's when I saw it. In the passenger seat, there was a folded piece of paper. My heart shot. I took the note with tremendous hands. The message written on it was short and direct. I know where you live. My mind went blank for a few seconds. How did someone get in my car? What do you want with me? And more importantly, who could have done it? The parking lot was empty, and the man was not in sight. But I knew that was not a coincidence. At that moment, my mind was taken by pure panic. Locked all the doors of the car and looked around, hoping to see someone coming out of the shadows or peeking from somewhere. But the parking lot remained empty and silent, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, but my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to start the engine. When I finally did, I drove home at high speed, looking in the rearview mirror every few seconds. The feeling that someone was following me was suffocating, even if there was no car behind me. When I got home, I locked the door immediately and stood in the room, deceiving myself. I took the note out of my pocket and read again. I know where you live. What did that do exactly? Was it just a threat or something else? I called a close friend and told him what happened, but he tried to play it down, saying that it was probably just a bad joke. But I knew it wasn't. Something about that man in the parking lot, the way he watched me every night. I said that was personal. The fear that he might show up at any moment would not leave me alone. The next morning, I woke up after a sleepless night. I couldn't get the note out of my head. Every time I thought about the message in the unlocked door, my mind went too far, creating scenarios that I did not want to imagine. I decided to report the case to the university security. When I got there, I explained the situation, describing the man in the parking lot and showing the ticket. They listened carefully, but the most they promised to do was reinforce the night round. They said that the parking lot had no cameras in the area where I used to park, which only made my feeling of impotence worse. That night, I left work early, determined to park in a different location. I chose a well-lit parking spot close to other people. When I came back later, I felt a relief to see that the place was busy. Got into the car, and before I left, I looked around to make sure no one was around. It was then that I noticed something strange on the windshield. There was another note stuck under the wiper. I got out of the car with my heart pounding and took the paper. The message was even more direct. "Do you think you can hide?" At that moment, I realized that changing the place had not made a difference. Whoever it was watching me closely. When I read that message, my heart popped in a way that seemed impossible to control. Got into the car immediately, locking the doors before even starting the engine. Paranoia was consuming me. I looked everywhere, but the parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars scattered and no people in sight. I turned on the engine and left as fast as I could, but this time I went straight to the police station. I explained everything to the officer on duty, showing the 2 tickets that I had received. He listened carefully, but seemed more skeptical than I expected. Said that without concrete evidence or witnesses, it would be difficult to do anything other than register the case. After leaving the police station, I was standing in the car, thinking about what to do. The idea of coming home seemed unbearable, but I had nowhere else to go. When I finally decided to drive, I realized something that made my stomach turn. In the rearview mirror, I saw a car parked on the opposite street with the headlights off. It seemed parked, but there was no reason to be there. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the feeling that I was being followed did not leave me. I took an alternative way home, changing direction a few times, but when I finally arrived, I still felt that weight, as if being observed, even in the silence of my own room. That night, I could not sleep. Every little sound seemed amplified. The wind creaking in the window, the footsteps of the neighbors in the apartment above, even the sound of the clock on the wall. I kept imagining that at any moment, I would hear something coming from the door or window. I decided to leave the lights on in the room, something that I did not do since childhood. I took my phone to try to distract myself, but the note was still in my head, especially the phrase, "Do you think you can hide?" Whoever it was seemed to be telling me that nothing I did would change the fact that he knew where to find me. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a low noise coming from the front of the apartment. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard again. It was a sound of something being dragged, very light but very close. My heart popped. I went to the door carefully without making a sound and looked through the peephole. I saw nothing, but the sound continued. Decided to wait there, motionless, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that, suddenly, everything became silent. I stood there for a few more minutes, until I had the courage to open the door, only to find another folded ticket on the floor, right in the entrance. This time, the message was even more disturbing. "I don't need to hit." At that moment, the only thing I could feel was pure terror. I was looking at the note for a few seconds, unable to process what was happening. Whoever it was, he wasn't just playing with my mind. He was showing me that he could reach out to me whenever he wanted. Quickly closed the door, locking it and pushing a piece of furniture to block the entrance. I took my cell phone and called the police one more time. This time, they seemed more concerned and promised to send a car to check the place. While I waited, I sat on the floor of the room, trying not to panic. When the police arrived, I explained everything. They checked the corridor and the area around the building, but as always, they did not find anyone. One of them suggested that I install security cameras, but at the time it seemed useless. Whoever it was, I had already made it clear that I knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, and how to get to me. After the police left, I felt even more exposed. Every shadow in the house seemed to hide something. Every sound seemed a threat. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the couch with all the lights on, hoping that was the end. The next morning, my mind was in complete confusion. I didn't know if I was paranoid or if I really was in imminent danger. I decided to take the day off without leaving home, trying to feel a little more secure. However, this did not last long. Around noon, I received a notification on my phone from an unknown number. It was a short message. "Do you think you are safe now?" My whole body was on alert. The message left no doubt that this person knew I was home and was probably watching me at that moment. I ran to the window, looking out into the street, but saw nothing suspicious. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I took my phone and sent the message to a close friend, asking him to come to my house. Explained the basics of the situation, and he arrived in less than an hour. It was a relief to have him there, but the tension was still palpable. While we discussed what to do, another notification arrived. It was a new message, and this time came with a photo. It was my door, the same one I had locked the night before, but the photo had been taken inside the corridor of the building. Whoever it was had been there again, and that meant he had access to the place. My friend was as alarmed as I, and we decided that we could not stay there without doing something concrete. That afternoon, my friend and I decided to leave the apartment and spend the night elsewhere. He suggested that we go to his house, since the building where he lived had cameras in all the entrances. I packed some basic things in a backpack, and we went out together, but even then I couldn't feel completely safe. During the journey, I kept looking through the rear-view mirror, trying to identify any car that might be following us. Fortunately, I did not see anything strange, but the feeling of being watched did not leave me. When we arrived at my friend's building, he helped me to settle in the guest room and tried to reassure me. He said that maybe the police could track down the number who sent the messages or find something on the cameras in my building. I tried to hold on to it, but I couldn't help thinking about the note, the photo, and the message. How did someone get into my building without being noticed? And why was he doing this to me? Later that night, as I was trying to rest, my phone vibrated again. It was another message. She just said, "No use running away." When I read that message, it felt like the little control I had was slipping through my fingers. I showed the message to my friend, who immediately suggested that we turn off our cell phones and have any other communication. He thought it might be some kind of digital stalker, but deep down I knew it was something more physical. The message was not generic. It was a clear warning that this person knew exactly where I was. I spent the rest of the night looking at the bedroom windows, hoping to see something outside, but everything was too quiet, like the calm before a storm. About 3 in the morning, I heard a sound coming from the apartment corridor. It was light like steps, but hesitant. I looked at my friend, who was also awake, and whispered to him to make sure the door was locked. He nodded and went to check. When he came back, he said it was safe, but the tension in the air was suffocating. We tried to ignore the sound, but it kept coming closer and closer until it stopped right in front of the door of the room where we were. We were still listening while someone or something moved the handle, as if testing whether the door was open. After a few seconds of absolute silence, came a slight scratch, like nails scraping against the wood. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. We froze, not the courage to make any move. My friend took the phone, but realized that he had left it in the other room. I was also without mine, since we had hung up to avoid messages. The only thing we could do was listen. The scratches continued for a few more seconds, and then silence returned. It was as if the person on the other side were waiting for a reaction from us. My heart was so fast that I could barely breathe, trying not to make any noise that could denounce our presence. After a time that seemed like an eternity, we heard footsteps coming back down the corridor. This time they were more firm, as if whoever was going away. I waited until I heard nothing more before whispering to my friend that we needed to get out of there. He agreed and, with the greatest possible care, unlocked the door, and we went to the room to get the cell phones. But when we turned on the light, we saw something that left us in total panic. On the coffee table was a note, written in the same handwriting as the previous messages. I said that no use running away. At that moment, panic took hold. We took the cell phones, locked the door again, and called the police. While we waited, we stood in the middle of the room, trying to understand how the note had stopped there. The door of the apartment was locked, and no one but us should be inside. My friend, visibly shaken, began to review the security cameras of the building by his mobile application, since he had access to the images. It was then that we saw something that left both speechless. Around 3 a.m, a hooded figure appeared in the corridor. You couldn't see his face, but it was clear that the person was holding something in their hands. It looked like a piece of paper. The figure stopped in front of the apartment for a few seconds, moved the handle, and then seemed to slide the note under the door. But there was an even more disturbing detail. As soon as it ended, the person looked directly at the camera, as if he knew we were watching. The face was covered by the hood, but the gesture was so deliberate that it seemed like a message. When the police arrived, we showed everything, but as always, there was not much to do. The building was locked, and no one had seen or heard anything but us. Still, the police said they would keep an eye on us and suggested we should be alone. After the police officers left, the atmosphere became even more heavy. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, and every sound sounded like a threat. My friend tried to look confident, but I could see he was also shaken. We decided that we couldn't stay there any longer. We pack our things and leave together, still in the early hours. We drive without a clear destination, just trying to get away from the situation. The idea was to go to a hotel, a busy place, where we felt that we were more protected. While driving, my friend's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and became pale. It was another message, this time to him. "Do you think he's safe with you?" Fear took hold of us. Whoever it was knew we were together and seemed determined to make us feel vulnerable no matter where we were. As soon as we arrived at the hotel, we tried to rest, but sleep did not come. We took turns looking through the windows and checking the corridors, hoping something would happen, but nothing happened that night. Yet we knew that we were not free. This person, or whatever it was, seemed to always be one step ahead. The next morning, we decided to review all messages and tickets, trying to find any pattern or clue that could help us. My friend was convinced that this person had access to some way to track our movements, but we did not know how. Reviewing the security cameras of his building, we noticed a detail that we had ignored before. The hooded figure did not enter through the main entrance, as we had imagined. Instead, he suddenly appeared at a point in the corridor without passing through any of the external cameras. It was as if he was already inside the building. It made everything even more strange. Someone who knew where I was, who could get into locked buildings without leaving a trace. It was hard not to think the worst. We decided to go back to the station, but to our surprise, the police seemed more skeptical this time. They said that without concrete evidence or witnesses who could confirm any act illegal, they could do little more than record the reports. The feeling of impotence was overwhelming. After we left the police station, another message arrived. It was short, but disturbing. "You haven't understood yet, have you?" I looked at my friend, and at that moment I realized we were in the center of something that we couldn't control or explain. After that message, my mind started spiraling. What could "you have not understood yet" mean? It was as if this person was playing a game that only she knew the rules. We spent all day trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home and try to get some normality back, but my friend insisted that it would be dangerous. In the end, we decided to come back to my building together during the day to pick up some essential things and check out the place. When we arrived at the building, the mood was different, more tense than usual. The doorman informed us that one of the cameras near my apartment had been damaged the previous morning. My throat dried up at the time. That meant someone had come back there, probably after I left. We went up to my apartment carefully, checking every corner before entering. Nothing seemed out of place at first sight, but when I walked into the room, I saw something that made my legs go flat. On my pillow, there was another note. This time, the message was even more direct. "You can't run away from what's coming." It was official. It wasn't just a chase, it was a clear threat. After finding that note, we left the apartment immediately. We had no doubt that this person, whoever it was watching us closely and entering wherever he wanted, without leaving a trace. We decided to go back to the hotel and try to organize our ideas, but the fear was already so deep that any plan seemed useless. Along the way, my friend suggested that we hire a digital and physical security expert, as it seemed like this person knew exactly how to track us. I agreed, but deep down I was wondering if someone could really help us. That night, at the hotel, we were discussing what to do when suddenly the phone rang in the room. My friend answered, but was silent. His face lost color completely, and he passed me the phone without saying a word. When I put the device in my ear, I heard a heavy breath and a low voice, almost a whisper, say, "Do you still think you can hide?" I hung up immediately and started packing our things. We left the hotel in a hurry, not knowing where to go. It was as if every move we made was predicted, as if this person was always in front of us, manipulating the situation from afar. After leaving the hotel, we drove aimlessly, trying to decide what to do. Every place seemed unsafe, every movement seemed observed. My friend suggested that we go to a nearby town, where we could stay somewhere less predictable. I agreed, but deep down I felt that none of this mattered. It seemed impossible to escape from this presence, as if it was stuck to us. During the trip, paranoia only increased. Every car that appeared in the rearview mirror, we thought it was someone following us. We arrived in the nearby town late at night and found a simple motel. The place was secluded and seemed perfect to stay off the radar. We settled in the room and tried to calm down. For a few hours, the silence of the place seemed almost comforting. But around 2 in the morning, a low sound coming from outside the door of the room made us freeze. It was as if someone was scratching the wood, slow and rhythmic, just like the night before in my friend's apartment. I looked at him, and we were both paralyzed. The sound stopped for a few seconds, only to be replaced by firm beats. Before we had time to react, my phone vibrated. The message said, "Did you really think you could escape?" The dread took hold of us at that moment. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The beats continued for a few seconds, as if the person outside knew exactly how to destabilize us. My friend picked up the phone to call the reception, but when it started to go down, the beats stopped abruptly. We stand still, just listening, waiting for the next move. I decided to take my phone and answer the message, even though it was probably useless. I wrote, "What do you want from us?" and sent it. It didn't take long to get a response. The message said, "It's already happening." The sound that came next was even more disturbing. It was as if someone was scratching the glass of the small window in the room. I stood up slowly and glanced at it, but saw nothing but the reflection of the light in the room. My friend stood by the door, holding a chair, ready to react. But before we could decide what to do, a new message arrived on my phone. It said, "Look out." My heart seemed to stop. Look or not look. That seemed exactly what this person wanted, to manipulate us, to get us into her game. I decided not to give in and stayed where I was waiting. But deep down, I knew that person would not give up so easily. The silence that followed was even more frightening than the previous sounds. There were no more bumps, scratches, or any sign that someone was outside, but this only made the situation more oppressive. My friend insisted on opening a crack in the window curtain to see what was happening. After much hesitation, he stepped forward and pulled the curtain slightly. The motel corridor was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but we both knew that didn't mean safety. As we tried to decide the next step, another message came. This time it was a picture. When I opened it, I felt my body freeze. It was a picture taken from the corridor of the motel, right in front of our door. But what made me more terrified was the detail that I had not noticed before. A piece of folded paper was attached to the doorway. I looked at my friend, and he understood immediately. We opened the door slowly, and there was the note, exactly as in the picture. Carefully picked it up and unfolded. The message was short and direct. "You're next." After reading that message, the reality of the situation finally hit me. Whoever it was playing with us, manipulating every decision we made. We closed the door immediately and began to pack our things, ready to leave the motel, even without knowing where to go. We were acting by pure instinct, driven by fear. My friend called the front desk, but no one answered. It only made our sense of vulnerability worse. It was like we were completely isolated, just like this person wanted. While we were in the middle of packing our things, another message came to my phone. This time it was a video. I opened hesitantly, and what I saw made me lose my breath. The recording showed the entrance of the room where we were, but it was in real time. The camera trembled slightly, as if someone was holding the phone and recording from the hallway. On the screen, we can see the shadow of someone moving slowly back and forth, as if he was deliberately provoking us. We closed the curtains and pushed the furniture to block the door, but we already knew. This person was not only watching us, he was playing a game from which we could not escape. After reading that message, the reality of the situation finally hit me. Whoever it was playing with us, manipulating every decision we made. We closed the door immediately and began to pack our things, ready to leave the motel, even without knowing where to go. We were acting by pure instinct, driven by fear. My friend called the front desk, but no one answered. It only made our sense of vulnerability worse. It was like we were completely isolated, just like this person wanted. While we were in the middle of packing our things, another message came to my phone. This time, it was a video. I opened hesitantly, and what I saw made me lose my breath. The recording showed the entrance of the room where we were, but it was in real time. The camera trembled slightly, as if someone was holding the phone and recording from the hallway. On the screen, we can see the shadow of someone moving slowly back and forth, as if he was deliberately provoking us. We closed the curtains and pushed the furniture to block the door, but we already knew. This person was not only watching us, he was playing a game from which we could not escape. The tension in the room was unbearable. We were cornered, with no idea what to do or where to go. The silence outside only made it worse. My friend started to search the backpack, looking for something to use as a defense, while I kept an eye on the phone, waiting for more messages or some sign that this person was still there. A few minutes later, another sound broke the silence. A slight click coming from the door lock, as if someone was trying to open it. My heart popped. I looked at my friend, who was already holding a chair with both hands, ready for anything. Suddenly the phone vibrated again. It was a new message. "Don't worry, I won't go in." "Not yet." I read those words out loud, and it only increased the terror we already felt. Whoever it was seemed to know exactly how to manipulate us, how to keep total control of the situation. We stood still, without courage to do anything, waiting for something to happen. The silence returned, but the feeling of being observed did not leave us. It seemed that we were stuck in a psychological game, and every moment became more clear that there was no easy way out. We stood still for several minutes, just listening, waiting for something else to happen. But the silence outside remained, and that only made it more frightening. We decided that we couldn't stand still, so we started calling the police again. This time, the attendant promised to send a car immediately to the motel. While we waited, we pushed all the furniture we could against the door as a last layer of protection. Each second seemed an eternity, and the weight of tension was unbearable. Finally, we heard the sound of tires in the parking lot gravel. I looked through the crack of the curtain and saw the blue rotating light of the car illuminating the corridor. We ran to open the door and found two policemen coming out of the car. We tried to explain what was happening, showing the messages and recording, but as we were talking I noticed something strange. The corridor was completely empty. There was no sign of anyone. The police did a quick search in the area and said they found nothing. They recommended us to leave the motel and look for a safer place, but at that moment, something was clear to me. Whoever it was did not want to be caught. He just wanted to scare us. And it was working. We decided not to stay at the motel anymore. We took our things and left immediately, with the police still patrolling the area. We chose to drive aimlessly, just to get out of there and try to get away from everything. During the journey, the silence in the car was heavy. My friend was trying to think of a plan, but my mind was completely taken by the messages, the tickets, and what seemed like an endless game. More and more I asked myself, why us? What did this person want? As we drove down a deserted road, my phone vibrated again. I hesitated to look, but knew I had no choice. When I picked up the phone, I saw that it was another message. "You are moving away, but you will never be far enough." I showed it to my friend, and panic took over. He stopped the car on the side of the road, saying we needed to decide what to do. But before we could think of anything, we realized something that left us in shock. In the rear-view mirror, we saw lights on, stopped on the road, at a distance that seemed safe but clearly intentional. Whoever it was, he was there, following us, and made it clear that no matter where we went, he would always be close. We were staring at those headlights in the rear-view mirror, not knowing what to do. My friend suggested to speed up and try to lose whoever it was, but I knew that this person was playing with us. It was not a common chase. It was as if everything was calculated to leave us on the edge. After a few seconds, the headlights began to move slowly, advancing towards us, but at such a controlled speed that it seemed deliberately provocative. My friend turned on the car and started driving, trying to keep calm, but the tension in the air was unbearable. The headlights followed us for a few minutes, always keeping the same distance, until they suddenly disappeared. We turned on a side road, trying to get away, but the feeling that we were still being watched did not leave me. When I looked at my phone again, there was another message waiting for me. "You can't escape. I'll always know where you are." That was the last straw. We decided that the only option was to go directly to the nearest police station and not leave there until someone took us seriously. It didn't matter what was happening anymore. We needed help before something worse happened. We arrived at the police station of the neighboring city just before dawn. We were exhausted physically and mentally, but determined to get some answer. The police listened carefully to us as we told them everything. The tickets, the messages, the recording of the cameras, and the car that followed us. We showed all the evidence we had, and this time they seemed to take the situation more seriously. One of the officers said it was possible to trace the number that was sending the messages, but that this would take some time. Meanwhile, they recommended that we stay there at the station until they had something more concrete. During those hours at the police station, I felt a little relief. We were surrounded by people in a seemingly safe place, but the feeling of being observed still hovered over me. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, one of the officers came back with a serious countenance. He said they had analyzed the number of messages and found that it came from a disposable device, something that made tracking difficult. But what really shocked me was what he said next. The last signal of the device was tracked a few meters from where we were parked in the car during the night. This meant that while we were on the side of the road, this person was there, watching closely. That information made my heart race. The fact that this person was so close to us, practically lurking in the dark, was terrifying. My friend became pale and began to pressure the police to take some concrete action. They said they sent a team to patrol the area where the signal was tracked, but there were no guarantees that they would find anything. Meanwhile, they recommended that we stay at the station until we were sure it was safe to leave. A few hours later, while we were still waiting, my phone vibrated again. I hesitated to look, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The message was different this time. There was no text, just a photo. When I opened it, I felt the ground disappear under my feet. The image showed the police station where we were. It was not a generic photo. It was a recent image, taken from the outside, exactly where we had entered hours before. I showed it to the nearest police officer, who immediately went out to check the area but found no one. Whoever it was knew where we were, even inside what should be a safe place. At that moment, it became clear that this person was not just following us, he was surrounding us. After that photo, fear turned into a constant fright. How did this person know exactly where we were? How did you manage to take a picture without anyone noticing? I started questioning everything, even the people around us. Was she inside the police station all the time? My friend, who until then was trying to keep calm, began to panic. He suggested that maybe we were being tracked in some way, that our phones or even the car could have some device installed. The police agreed that it was possible and asked our devices to inspect them. While they were doing that, we tried to think of a strategy to get out of town and go somewhere where this person could not find us. It was then that my friend noticed something strange in the windshield of the car we had parked in front of the police station. There was another note stuck under the wiper as a reminder that it didn't matter where if we were. This person would always be a step ahead. With much fear, we went out to catch him, accompanied by a police officer. The note said, "Do you still think this is just a chase?" That phrase echoed in my mind as we went back inside. What else could it be? After reading that note, I realized the situation was much bigger than we had imagined. Do you still think this is just a chase? What did that mean? The police officer who was with us tried to keep calm, but I could see in his face that he was also worried. We went back inside the police station, and officers intensified analysis on cell phones and cars. They said that if there was any tracking device, it would be identified, but until then they had found nothing. Meanwhile, I received another message, this time without any text, just an audio recording. With my trembling hands, I put the audio to play. At first it was just silence, but after a few seconds the sound of footsteps echoed. They seemed to be in a closed environment, perhaps a corridor, but what left me paralyzed was the final sound. A door being opened and the voice of someone whispering my name. I closed the audio immediately, but the impact was already done. My friend looked at me and knew, without need to say, that whoever it was much closer than we imagined. After that audio, the tension reached an unbearable level. The police officer who was with us listened to the recording and immediately triggered his colleagues. They started monitoring all the entrances and exits of the police station, but deep down I knew that it would not make a difference. Whoever it was, he had already shown that he could be anywhere he wanted to be, even under surveillance. My friend suggested that we leave from there, but where could we go? It seemed that every movement was being anticipated. While we discussed what to do, another message arrived, but this time it was not on my cell phone. It was on the phone of my friend. It was another photo, and when he opened, I saw the fear take over his face. The picture showed us both sitting inside the police station, at the exact moment we were looking at the audio on my phone. It was impossible. No one was there with a camera, and yet the picture was sharp, taken from an angle that seemed impossible. The message that accompanied the photo was short, but clear. You cannot escape because I have never been away. At that moment, the reality of what we were facing became unbearable. This was not just a physical persecution. It was something much deeper, something that seemed to go beyond any logic. After seeing that photo, the feeling of impotence became overwhelming. How could someone have taken a photo inside the police station, under surveillance, without anyone noticing? My friend was visibly shaken, almost in panic, and the police began to question whether we were really safe there. It was then that one of the officers suggested we check the internal system of cameras in the police station. Maybe there was something that explained how that picture was taken. While they were analyzing the recordings, we sat in silence, waiting for some answer. After a few minutes, the policeman came back with a look that mixed confusion and concern. He showed us the recording of the exact moment the photo was taken. What we saw was even more disturbing. In the video, they appear exactly as we were in the photo, but in the corner of the screen, for a fraction of a second, a strange shadow seemed to move. It was not a person, at least not clearly. It was something fast, blurry, as if the video itself was corrupted. The policeman looked at us and said, "It doesn't make sense. There's no one here, but something is clearly wrong with that." After watching the recording, my mind began to spiral. It no longer seemed like a simple chase. It looked like something that challenged what I understood to be real. The officer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to justify the shadow as a technical problem, but we all knew it was not that simple. My friend, who until then had been trying to keep his composure, began to pressure the officers to do something concrete, but nobody seemed to know what else could be done. While we were discussing, my phone vibrated again. This time the message was not text or image, but a video. I hesitated to open, but knew I couldn't ignore it. When I pressed play, I felt my stomach turn around. The video showed my apartment. It was a static angle, as if the camera was positioned in some corner of the room. There was no one in the picture, but what really scared me was the recording time. It was that morning, even before we went to the police station. That meant that while we were running away and trying to protect ourselves, this person had already entered my safer space and made it clear that he would always be one step ahead. After watching the video, my whole body was in shock. The idea that this person had already been in my apartment, even before all of this escalated to the point where we were now, was unbearable. I showed the video to the police, who immediately asked them to search the place. But honestly, deep down, I knew they would find nothing. This person, or whatever it was not just careful. He seemed to be playing at a completely different level, something that defied any attempt at logic or explanation. While the team was getting ready to go to my apartment, another message arrived. He said, "No use coming back, there is nothing there for you." That was confirmation that this presence was monitoring us in real time, knowing every step we took, even within the police station. My friend, who was trying to keep control, began to show clear signs of despair. He pulled me aside and said, "I don't think it's just one person. That doesn't make sense. What if we're dealing with something we can't understand?" For the first time, I considered this possibility. For the first time, I accepted that maybe we were fighting against something that was not simply human. From that moment on, everything started to seem unreal. The message, the video, the shadow in the camera, everything pointed to something that did not fit into what we consider normal. Still, we headed to my apartment with the police, as if there was still a chance of finding some rational explanation. When we arrived, I felt a shiver in the spine. The door was locked, just as I left it, but something seemed out of place. We entered slowly, the police officers in front, and the silence in the environment was so heavy that it seemed to have its own life. While the police searched every corner, my friend and I stood in the room, watching. There seemed to be no signs of invasion, but at the same time the apartment did not seem to be mine anymore. It was as if space had been invaded in an invisible way. It was then that one of the police officers called us to the room. He pointed to the mirror in the closet, where something was written with what seemed to be a finger dragged through the dust. The words were simple but devastating. "You are exactly where I want you." The feeling of being manipulated, as pieces in a game we do not understand, has become inescapable. After reading those words in the mirror, I felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The police officers were tense, but tried to keep their composure, saying it could be some joke or something left behind. But I knew it wasn't. The writing was fresh, and no one but us should have been there. One of them took pictures for the report, while another continued to look for some sign of invasion, but again nothing was found. Whatever it was, it seemed to want to make us feel powerless, completely at our mercy. While the cops were busy, my phone vibrated once again. Opened the message with trembling hands, and this time there was no text, just another photo. It was a picture taken from my room, exactly where we were at that moment. The angle showed me my friend, and the two cops standing in front of the mirror. My heart almost stopped. I looked back to try to understand where that could have been taken from, but there was no one there. The police officer took my phone from my hand, looked at the photo, and for the first time admitted, "This doesn't make sense. It's like it's coming from inside, but there's no one here." After hearing the police admit that it didn't make sense, my mind collapsed. I looked around the room, hoping to see some clue, anything that would explain how that picture had been taken, but there was nothing. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, as if the environment itself were alive. My friend, who was already completely shaken, began to insist that we go away for good, leave the apartment and any attempt to find logic in it. And honestly, he was right. Standing there seemed like a trap. As we prepared to leave, another message came to my phone. This time it was a video. Reluctantly, I opened it knowing that nothing good would come from it. The video was short, just a few seconds, but enough to make me panic. He showed the same mirror where the message had been written, but now in the background, you could see a dark figure, still, almost indistinct, as if it was mixing with the darkness of the room. The video ended with the camera approaching the mirror, and before it was erased, another sentence appeared written. "You will never understand." The police officer who was with me saw the video and immediately called for reinforcements. It was clear that he was also scared, although he tried to keep his posture. We left the apartment at that time, leaving everything behind. To this day, I don't know who or what was chasing us but never came back. Whatever it was, you won the game. The stalker of light poles. I always used the same bus stop to get home from work. It was one of those simple places, with a rusty metal bench and a light pole that would blink from time to time. The area wasn't exactly busy at night, but I never felt unsafe until a few weeks ago. That's when I started to notice a man standing under the light pole, almost every night, in exactly the same position. He seemed harmless at first sight, always looking at the phone or just staring at the ground. I didn't pay much attention, but over time I began to realize that he was never there during the day, only at night when the spot became more empty. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, or maybe taking the same bus at different times than mine. But one night, while I was waiting alone, I felt that he was looking directly at me. It was not obvious, but you could tell by the subtle movements of the head. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling bothered me more than I would like to admit. When the bus arrived, I quickly got in and didn't look back. But that night, his presence was hammering in my head. Who was he? Why was he always there, in the same place? And why did he seem to be looking at me so deliberately? The next night, he was there again. Same place, same posture. This time, I decided to observe better, trying to understand if I was exaggerating or if there was something really strange. He looked like an ordinary man, wearing a dark coat, jeans, and a cap that always kept down. Despite this, there was something in the way he stood that made me uneasy, as if he was waiting for something specific. When the bus arrived, I went up quickly, but as the doors closed, I looked out of the window and I swear he was staring at me. It was fast, but enough for the cold in the spine to accompany me for the rest of the way. Some days later, things started getting even stranger. I got to the point as usual, but this time the man was not there. I felt an immediate relief, but as I waited, something stuck to the light pole caught my attention. It was a piece of paper. Curious, I approached and pulled the paper. When I turned, my heart almost stopped. It was a hand drawing, a portrait of my face, made with impressive details. It even captured the shape of my hair and the expression I had when I was distracted. Had no name or signature, just the drawing. I looked around looking for it, but there was nobody around. Holding the drawing with my hands trembling, not knowing what to think. I looked around again, but the place was deserted. The bus arrived a few minutes later, and I came feeling a growing discomfort. All the way, I was looking at the paper, trying to find some explanation. Who could have done that? And how did you know so much about me? The level of detail in the drawing was disturbing, as if the person was watching me for hours. When I got home, I put the paper in a drawer and tried to forget what had happened, but the feeling that something was wrong kept me awake that night. The next night he was back. Same place, same way. This time, my anxiety was on the edge, and I could barely disguise the nervousness while waiting for the bus. He did not look directly at me, but I felt his presence was almost overwhelming. When the bus arrived, I rushed in without looking back. But as I sat down, I looked out of the window, and again he was looking at me. This time, his head was slightly tilted, as if he was analyzing something. I could not look away until the bus started moving, and only then I realized that I was holding my breath. After that night, I started to obsess about what was happening. It was not normal to see someone so often in the same place, with that strange posture and the look that seemed to follow me. I decided to take a different route the next day and avoid the bus stop where he used to stay. I walked a few more blocks to another point, less isolated and with more movement. I was relieved not to see him there, but still, I could not feel safe. It seemed that at any moment he could appear, coming out of some dark corner. When I got home that night, I found something even more disturbing. Stuck in the door of my apartment was another drawing. It was as detailed as the first one, but this time the angle was different, like someone looking at me while I read something on my phone. My knees almost gave way. How did he know where I lived? And how did he get to my door without anyone noticing? Took the drawing and went in, locking all doors and windows. I spent the rest of the night checking every sound, every shadow, trying to figure out if he was still around. That night, I stayed up late, unable to relax. The drawing was on my desk, and I could not stop looking at it. The level of detail was so precise that it seemed impossible to have been made from memory. Whoever it was watching me closely, much closer than I could have imagined. I decided to call a friend, trying to explain what was happening, but as he spoke, I realized how absurd it sounded. "Maybe it's just someone trying to scare you," he said, trying to calm me down. Despite the good intention, his words didn't help. I knew something was very wrong. The next day, I took an Uber to work, completely avoiding the bus stop. But at night, I had to stop by to pick up something I'd forgotten in a nearby store. When I turned the corner, my heart sank. He was there, standing in the same place as always, under the light pole. This time he seemed to be holding something in his hands, but it was too far away for me to see what it was. I felt the urge to turn around, but my curiosity won. Keeping distance, I got close enough to see that he was holding a clipboard and seemed to be drawing. When he looked up and saw me, a look that seemed like a mixture of recognition and satisfaction crossed his face. That's when I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. He did not move, remained standing under the pole, but his fixed gaze was almost unbearable. I decided not to approach anymore. I turned around and started to walk fast towards the opposite side, feeling my heart racing. I looked back a few times, and he was still there, but now it seemed like he had taken some steps in my direction. He wasn't chasing me, but the simple fact that he moved was enough to speed my pace even more. I came home panting and, without thinking twice, locked all the doors and windows. As I tried to calm down, I felt a vibration in the phone. It was a message notification, but from an unknown number. My stomach turned. When I opened it, it was a photo, an image of the light pole where he stood. But the detail that made me freeze was that, in the background of the photo, I could clearly see the silhouette of someone turning the corner. It was me. The photo had been taken while I was running away. Turned off my phone and threw it on the couch, trying desperately to find an explanation for all that. Who was this person? What did she want from me? And how it seemed to be everywhere, watching me all the time. After seeing that photo, my instinct was to call the police. I called and explained everything. The drawings, the man on the light pole, and now the photo. They seemed skeptical, but promised to send a car to take a tour of my neighborhood. While I waited, I sat on the couch looking at the door with the feeling that at any moment he could appear. When the police arrived, the officers knocked on my door and asked for more details. I showed the drawings and the photo, but had no concrete information about the man beyond the general appearance. The police suggested that I avoid the bus stop and stay alert, but there was not much they could do without a direct threat or evidence of something more serious. After they left, I went to the window and looked out into the street. There was no sign of the man, but the feeling of being observed persisted. I decided to distract myself, but around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the front door. It was a low sound, as if something was being dragged against the wood. I stood still, trying to understand what was happening. When I created the courage to look through the eye hole, I didn't see anyone. But when I opened the door, there was another drawing stuck there. This time, it was written in large letters below the portrait, "No use to run." After reading that message, the fear turned into pure panic. Quickly closed the door, locking all the locks and pushing a piece of furniture to reinforce. My mind was a mess. Who is this person? How did she get so close without being seen? And more importantly, what did she want from me? I called the police again, trying to explain that the situation had escalated. They said that they sent another car, but again without concrete evidence of a direct threat, it was difficult to do anything. While waiting for the car, I realized that I was no longer safe at home. I started packing a backpack with some clothes and essentials, thinking of spending a few days at a friend's house. Before leaving, however, something caught my attention. In the window of the room, which looked out to the street, there was a reflection. As I approached, I realized it was another drawing, glued to the outside of the glass. My heart popped. The drawing was different from the others. It didn't just show my face, but my house in the background, as if it had been done while I was there right now. I looked out the window, but the street was empty. Whoever it was seemed to know exactly how to terrify me. At that moment, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I took the backpack that I had prepared, called my friend and quickly explained that I needed a place to stay. She noticed the panic in my voice and agreed without hesitation. While waiting for the taxi that had called, I was sitting in the corner of the room, with the lights off, trying not to make any sound. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I looked at the clock. Only 10 minutes had passed, but it seemed an eternity. When the taxi arrived, I ran out and got into the car without looking to the sides. The driver tried to start a conversation, but I could hardly respond. My gaze was fixed in the rearview mirror, waiting to see something or someone following us. Fortunately, the journey was smooth, and when I arrived at my friend's house, I felt a little safer. I explained everything to her, showing the drawings and messages. She was shocked and suggested that the next day they install cameras in my house to try to record something. I agreed, but deep down I knew that whoever it was, they always seemed to be one step ahead. That night was long. Every sound in her house seemed amplified, and sleep was impossible. The next morning, I went back to my apartment with my friend to install the cameras. We went together during the day, trying to take advantage of the sunlight to ease the discomfort. When we arrived, everything seemed calm, but the feeling that something was wrong did not leave me. While my friend began to position the cameras in strategic places, I went to the door to check if there was anything else left there. To my surprise, there was a new drawing stuck on the floor, right in front of the entrance. He showed something that made me completely cold. It was a picture of me and my friend getting into the taxi the night before. Held the paper with my hands shaking, showed it to her, and we both were paralyzed. This meant that he not only knew where I was, but he was also watching me at the very moment when I tried to escape. We decided to speed up the installation of the cameras, but the discomfort was almost unbearable. After we finished, we checked the images to make sure everything was working. Before leaving, my friend suggested that we check the recordings the next day, but deep down we knew that if something happened, it would probably be subtle enough to escape us. Even so, it was a small comfort to know that something was recording what happened there. That night, I went back to my friend's house. We decided it would be safer if we stayed together until we had some idea of what to do. We were both exhausted, but the fear and tension did not let us relax. At about 10 o'clock in the evening, my cell phone vibrated. It was a notification from the camera app we had installed. With shaking hands, I opened the alert which said, "Motion detected." My heart popped. I called my friend, and we both looked at the screen while the recording was loading. The video starts showing the entrance to my apartment. For a few seconds, there was nothing but a static view of the door. But suddenly a shadow appeared in the corner of the frame, slowly moving towards the camera. It was a human figure, standing right in front of the door, but with his face covered by something, perhaps a hood. The figure stood there for a few moments, motionless, looking directly at the camera, and then did something that left me without reaction. He reached out his hand and put another drawing on the door. The video ended soon after. My whole body was cold. The most disturbing was that the camera recorded no sound of steps, no input or output, only that static and disturbing presence. My friend and I stood still, looking at the video in complete silence. The idea that he was there, in front of my apartment, even knowing that there were cameras, was terrifying. It was as if he was playing with us, showing that he did not care to be seen because he knew no one could stop him. We decided not to wait any longer. I called the police again, explained about the recording, and insisted that they send someone immediately. They promised to send a team, but in the meantime we could do nothing but wait. While we waited, my friend had the idea of checking the camera in real time. When he opened the application, what we saw left us in absolute shock. It was still there, standing in front of the door of my apartment still. Did nothing, just stare at the camera, as if he knew we were watching. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the absolute silence of the scene made it seem even more disturbing. My friend closed the app immediately, unable to keep looking, but I could not take my eyes off. A few seconds later, the figure started moving. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed directly at the camera before turning his back and disappearing from the field of view. That gesture, simple and silent, was enough to take away any illusion of security. He knew exactly how to manipulate us, how to keep us on the edge of fear. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, but as I had feared, he was no longer there. We showed the video and the new drawing he had glued on the door. The officers inspected the place, but again there were no signs of a break-in or any evidence of how he was getting so close without being noticed. The new drawing was different. It didn't show my face or any ordinary scene. This time, it was a picture of me sitting next to my friend on the couch at her house. I immediately recognized the scenario. It was exactly where we were the night before, when we discussed what to do. The accuracy was frightening, capturing even small details, like the blanket that was on my legs and the glass of water on the coffee table. This meant that he was not only watching us in public, but also in private moments inside her house. When the police left, we were alone again, and the tension in the air was unbearable. My friend was convinced that we should leave the house and go somewhere completely unknown, but I was not sure if this would solve the problem. Whoever it was seemed to be able to find us anywhere. We decided to stay awake together, with the lights on, trying to protect us in the only way we could, waiting. That night was the longest of my life. Every little sound seemed to be full of threats. My friend, who was always practical and rational, was as shaken as I am. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, while we were trying to keep alert, my cell phone vibrated again. It was another notification from the camera. The heart went out before you even opened the app. When I finally saw the video, my hand started to shake so much that I almost dropped my phone. This time, the video showed the inside of my apartment. The camera captured the room, but it was empty. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake, but in the corner of the picture something started moving. It was him. The figure was in my apartment, walking quietly as if exploring. He stopped in front of the camera and stared fixedly, motionless for a few seconds. Then slowly he lifted the drawing that had been glued to the door before and showed it to the camera. The message below the picture left me speechless. This is not the end. I showed the video to my friend, who turned pale. We called the police immediately, and this time they promised to send someone to monitor the area at night. But the truth is that at that moment it was clear to me. No matter what we did, he was always ahead. This was not just a chase. It was something darker, something that could not be explained only with logic. And the worst of all is that, until today, he has never been found.